footprint hardens in wet volcanic ash, and for thousands of generations no one sees it. Rain falls, grass grows, animals pass over it, stone breaks, rivers change course, and the person who made it vanishes so completely that not even a name, a face, or a remembered story survives. Only the pressure of a foot remains, pressed into the earth at one exact moment when a human body moved across a dangerous landscape and kept going. Somewhere beyond that print there may have been a campfire, a child, a warning, a death, a decision to flee, a memory carried in the mind of someone who had no writing, no monuments, no archive, no guarantee that anything would last. Then time closes over it. This is the first great problem in human history. Not that the past is empty, but that it is almost unbearably full, and most of it has left no voice. The human story stretches back hundreds of thousands of years, but the part we can read with anything like confidence is a thin, bright edge at the end. Written history. The kind that gives names to kings, taxes to cities, laws to temples, and arguments to scribes, covers only a tiny fraction of the time our species has existed. Before that is not silence exactly. It is a different kind of record bones, tools, ash, pollen, cave walls, broken shells, teeth, footprints, butchered animal remains, traces of DNA clinging to ancient fragments, and landscapes that no longer look the way they did when people crossed them. It is a record that speaks, but never in complete sentences. Long before cities rise, before grain is counted in clay tablets, before borders are drawn and empires pretend they will last forever, humans are already moving through forests, savannas, tundra, wetlands, coasts, and deserts. They know the habits of animals in a way modern people can barely imagine. They read clouds, tracks, winds, berries, stars, and fear. They bury their dead in some places and leave them to the elements in others. They make stone tools so carefully that a single blade can reveal skill passed from hand to hand across generations. They use fire, pigments, ornaments, gestures, songs, and stories. They live inside worlds of meaning, yet almost all of that meaning is gone. What survives in the record suggests intelligence, adaptation, and memory, but it rarely explains motive. A stone point can show that someone hunted, but not whether hunger forced the hunt or ceremony shaped it. Red ochre on a body can suggest symbolism, but not the words spoken over the dead. A burned layer in a cave can show occupation, but not the quarrel, celebration, illness, or fear that fill the night around the flames. The evidence remains incomplete, and the incompleteness is not a small inconvenience. It is the central condition of studying deep human time. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because the farther back the trail goes, the stranger it becomes. Not because the people were less human, but because they were human in ways we can only partly recover. The biggest gaps in human history are not always dramatic holes where an entire civilization disappears overnight. Some are quieter and far older. They lie in the missing millions of ordinary days. A woman scraping hide beside a fire, a group deciding when to leave a valley, a child learning which plants poison the stomach and which heal pain, a hunter returning without the others, a family watching the coastline change year by year as ice melts somewhere beyond the horizon. These moments shaped survival as much as any battle or dynasty, yet they almost never enter history. The past preserves stone better than skin, disaster better than routine, elites better than common people, dry deserts better than wet forests, and accidents better than intention. That uneven preservation creates distortions. Archaeologists do not simply uncover the past as it was, they uncover the part of the past that happened to endure. A settlement built from mud, reeds, and wood may vanish almost completely, while a stone tomb nearby survives and gives the illusion that death mattered more than daily life. A literate empire may dominate the record, while neighbouring peoples who shaped its trade, wars, food, and beliefs appear only as vague outsiders. A dry cave can preserve a basket for thousands of years, while an entire village in a humid forest dissolves into soil. No single explanation fully accounts for what is remembered and what is lost, because survival in the archaeological record depends on climate, chemistry, violence, burial, chance, and the habits of later people. In this way, history begins as a puzzle made mostly of missing pieces. Science has become remarkably good at reading the pieces that remain. Ancient DNA can reveal meetings between human groups that left no written memory. Isotopes in teeth can show where someone grew up, what they ate, and whether they migrated. Pollen grains buried in lake mud can restore vanished forests and grasslands. Microscopic wear on tools can reveal whether stone cut meat, plants, hide, or wood. Charcoal can date a fire. A child's tooth can show stress from hunger or sickness. A skeleton can carry the marks of labour, injury, care, and sometimes violence. The dead do not speak, but their bodies are not silent. And yet the more science reveals, the more it exposes the edges of what remains unknown. Human beings did not move through time like a neat line of progress, from primitive darkness toward modern certainty. The record is messier. There are early hints of symbolic behaviour that appear, vanish, and appear again. There are tools that seem too advanced for old assumptions. There are migrations that happened earlier than expected, then stalled, failed, or left only faint genetic traces. There are populations known from DNA more than from bones. There are enormous cultural changes whose causes remain debated: the spread of farming, the birth of cities, the rise of inequality, the collapse of complex societies, the disappearance of entire ways of life. The missing archive is especially haunting because it includes most of the people who ever lived. Kings are late arrivals, farmers are late arrivals, cities are late arrivals. For the overwhelming majority of human existence, people lived in small groups, carried knowledge in memory, and left no written claim upon the future. Their histories were sung, spoken, acted, carved, painted, remembered, forgotten, and replaced. A story might survive for centuries around a fire, but unless it entered stone, bone, pigment, or later writing, it eventually dissolved with the breath that carried it. There is a strange humility in this. Modern people often imagine themselves surrounded by records, and in one sense they are messages, images, databases, maps, and archives multiply beyond comprehension. But deep time shows how fragile memory is. A flood can erase a valley. A war can burn a library. A disease can silence the last speakers of a language. A coastline can drown beneath rising seas. A script can survive perfectly on clay and still become unreadable if no one remembers how to hear it. Even when evidence remains, meaning can vanish. The first human gap, then, is not one mystery but the condition beneath all the others. It is the distance between lived experience and surviving evidence. Somewhere in that distance lie the first departures from Africa, the meetings with other human species, the origins of language, the sudden flowering of art, the submerged paths along Ice Age coasts, the decision to plant seeds and stay. the first cities, the unreadable scripts, the collapses, the plagues, and the lost knowledge that science can glimpse but not fully restore. To follow these gaps is not to chase fantasy. It is to stand close to the boundary between what can be known and what can only be inferred. The most compelling mysteries in human history are not empty spaces waiting to be filled with convenient stories. They are places where evidence survives just enough to disturb certainty. A bone from a cave, a genome from a finger fragment, a footprint on an ancient shore, a city buried under sand, a tablet no one can read, a farming village older than expected, a population that appears in DNA and then disappears from view. The trail begins with absence, but it does not remain empty. It begins with ash, stone, bone, and silence, and slowly the silence gathers shape. Human history is not a finished book with a few missing pages. It is more like a landscape after a storm, where fragments of roads emerge from mud, vanish beneath water, and reappear miles away, suggesting a route that once seemed obvious to those who walked it. The task is to follow without pretending the road is complete. The trail does not begin with a border or a map. It begins with bodies moving through landscapes that no longer exist in the same form, across grasslands that shift with climate, river corridors that open and close, coastlines now drowned, and deserts that are sometimes green enough to invite passage and sometimes dry enough to turn back even the most determined travellers. Early humans do not step out of Africa in one clean, heroic march. They pulse outward, retreat, mix, disappear, return, and try again, following animals, water, seasons, memory, and opportunity. What looks from a distance like migration may have felt, in lived experience, like ordinary survival repeated over thousands of years. Africa is not merely the starting point in a simple origin story. It is the deep reservoir of human diversity, the place where Homo sapiens emerges within a wider world of older human forms, shifting environments, and long experimentation. Fossils from different regions show that early modern humans were not born all at once in one perfect finished shape. Faces, skulls, bodies, and behaviors vary across time and place, suggesting a braided origin rather than a single spark. Scholars still debate exactly how these early populations connected with one another, but the general picture is clear enough to be powerful. Our species forms inside Africa through networks of groups spread across large distances, sometimes isolated, sometimes connected, carrying genes and skills through changing climates. Then, at different moments, some groups move beyond the continent. The old phrase "out of Africa" makes it sound like a door opened and humanity walked through. The evidence is stranger. There are signs of Homo sapiens or closely related populations outside Africa earlier than once expected, including remains in the eastern Mediterranean and hints farther into Asia. Some of these early expansions may not have led directly to most living people today. They may have been fragile movements, partial successes, human lines that reached new lands and then faded, leaving only scattered traces. The evidence remains incomplete, and the timing still shifts as new discoveries appear. Imagine the world during one of these windows. Sea levels rise and fall with ice locked in distant glaciers. Arabia, often imagined as a harsh barrier, is not always barren. At certain times, monsoon systems push farther north, grasslands spread, lakes form, and animals move through corridors that humans can follow. Stone tools appear near ancient lake beds, suggesting that people once lived where desert now dominates. The Sahara too changes character across deep time. It is not one permanent wall, but a breathing landscape, sometimes crossed by rivers and wetlands, sometimes sealed by heat and dust. Migration depends on these openings. A green corridor may last long enough for many generations to pass through, then close again, cutting off those who remain beyond it. This is one of the biggest gaps science still wrestles with, not whether humans left Africa, but exactly how many times, by which routes, and with what consequences. Did some follow the Nile into the Levant? Did others move along southern coastal routes through Arabia, India, and beyond? How much did shorelines matter, and how much of the evidence now lies underwater? Were these movements driven by population pressure, curiosity, climate, prey, social tension, or simply the slow expansion of known territory? No single explanation fully accounts for this, because migration is rarely one decision. It is a chain of small decisions that only becomes a migration when seen from far away. The people who moved outward carried more than tools. They carried fire knowledge, kinship systems, food traditions, gestures, sounds, fears, and ways of reading the world. They also entered lands already occupied by other human beings. Neanderthals lived across parts of Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans, known first from a small finger bone and teeth in Siberia, left genetic traces across Asia and Oceania. Other populations, some still barely known, may have occupied islands, forests, mountains and valleys. The outward journey of Homo sapiens was not an empty world expansion. It was a meeting, and sometimes a merging. In the genetic record, those meetings remain. Many people outside Africa carry small amounts of Neanderthal ancestry. Some populations, especially in parts of Oceania and Southeast Asia, carry Denisovan ancestry. These traces are not decorative footnotes. They show that early humans encountered relatives close enough to have children with them, and distant enough that their differences still echo in bodies today. Some inherited genes may have helped later populations adapt to new environments, including immune challenges and high-altitude living. But the human encounters behind those genes are lost. The record tells us contact happened. It does not tell us whether those contacts were peaceful, violent, rare, repeated, intimate, desperate, or ordinary. The farther the trail goes, the more ghostly it becomes. Australia, for example, is reached by modern humans astonishingly early, requiring movement across water gaps even when sea levels are lower than today. This does not necessarily mean open ocean navigation in the later seafaring sense, but it does mean planning, perception, and social coordination beyond the old stereotype of wandering bands. The settlement of Sahul, the Ice Age landmass joining Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, raises difficult questions. How quickly did people spread through its varied environments? What happened to the giant animals there after humans arrived? How much was due to hunting, fire, climate, or some combination still debated? What survives in the record suggests rapid adaptation, but many details remain beyond recovery. Europe tells a different story. Homo sapiens arrive in a land shaped by Neanderthal presence, cold climates, and dramatic environmental swings. The archaeological record shows changes in tools, ornaments, art, and settlement patterns, but the relationship between newcomers and older inhabitants remains complex. In some places, technologies overlap. In others, populations seem to replace one another. The temptation is to turn this into a simple contest, but the evidence resists simplicity. Climate pressure, small population sizes, disease, competition, interbreeding, and cultural exchange may all have mattered. What looks like disappearance in the fossil record may have included absorption into expanding human groups. Farther east, the gaps widen again. Southeast Asia, island worlds, tropical forests, and drowned shelves preserve evidence unevenly. Warm, wet environments are often cruel to bones and organic material. Entire chapters of migration may have taken place in places where preservation was poor or where later sea level rise erased the old ground. During glacial periods, these undershelf connected much of mainland Southeast Asia with islands that are now separated by shallow seas. Humans, animals, forests, and rivers occupied landscapes now hidden underwater. Modern maps mislead the imagination. The coastline seen today is not the coastline early humans knew. This matters because some of the most important routes may now be submerged: a camp beside an Ice Age river mouth, a shell midden on a vanished shore, a crossing point between islands, a place where families watch tides and winds for generations, all may lie beneath meters of water and sediment. Archaeology on land gives the impression that humans preferred inland caves and river valleys, but caves preserve well and coastlines drown. The evidence is biased by survival. Scholars still debate how heavily early humans depended on coastal resources, but it's increasingly clear that shorelines were not marginal. They were highways, larders, and memory lines at the edge of continents. The Americas carry their own version of the problem. For much of the 20th century, a later migration model dominated, with people entering through an ice-free corridor after the height of the last ice age. But discoveries have pushed human presence earlier and complicated the route. Coastal migration along the Pacific edge now receives serious attention, partly because interior routes may not have opened in time for the earliest accepted sites. Yet much of the ancient coast is drowned. The earliest travellers into the Americas may have moved through kelp-rich shorelines, by foot and perhaps by simple boats, leaving camps that the sea later swallowed. The evidence remains incomplete, and some proposed very early sites remain disputed, but the old certainty has broken. What is striking across all these migrations is not just human movement, but human vulnerability. Many expansions may have failed. Groups could enter new regions and vanish without descendants. A cold snap, a drought, a volcanic winter, an unfamiliar disease, a failed hunting season, or a conflict with neighbouring groups could end a local population. The genetic ancestors of living people are not the same as all the people who once lived. Countless human journeys left no surviving line. They are part of history, but not ancestry. This is why the map of human expansion is not a spreading stain of certainty. It is a flicker. Presence appears here, disappears there, returns elsewhere. Some populations leave tools but no DNA. Others leave DNA but few bones. Some roots are inferred from genetics, others from artifacts, others from environmental reconstruction. Each kind of evidence has its own strengths and blind spots. Stone tools can travel through exchange or imitation. Genes can vanish through later replacement. Fossils can be absent where people certainly lived. A map built from all three is powerful, but still unfinished. The first steps outward reveal a pattern that will repeat throughout human history. People move when worlds change, but they also change the worlds they enter. They carry knowledge and inherit danger. They meet others and become partly them. They cross landscapes that later disappear, leaving modern science to reconstruct roads from scattered stones and fragments of bone. The mystery is not that humans migrated. The mystery is how many human histories were folded into those migrations and then lost, leaving only traces in blood, ash, tools, and drowned land. Beyond the first outward roads lies a stranger truth for most of humanity's deep past. We were not alone. The world was not filled with one human species moving into empty space, but with several kinds of humans, each shaped by different climates, distances, bodies, and histories. Some were broad-faced and powerful, living through cold cycles in Europe and Western Asia. Some are known from so little bone that they seem almost like shadows caught by science at the last possible moment. Some lived on islands, small in stature and mysterious in origin. Others may still wait unnamed in caves, sediments, and genomes. The human family was once a crowded landscape, and then, with unsettling speed, it became almost empty. Neanderthals are the most familiar of these vanished relatives, but familiarity can be misleading. They were not failed versions of us, nor crude figures waiting to be replaced by a superior form. They survived for hundreds of thousands of years across harsh and unstable environments. Their bodies were strong, compact, and well suited to cold. Their tools were carefully made. They hunted large animals at close range, used fire, occupied caves and open-air sites, and in some places appear to have used pigments, ornaments, and perhaps symbolic practices. What survives in the record suggests intelligence and endurance, not simplicity. The mystery is not why such beings existed, but why they vanished. Their disappearance is one of the great unresolved problems in human history because every simple answer breaks under pressure. Climate alone does not fully explain it, because Neanderthals had survived earlier climate swings. Direct violence from Homo sapiens is possible in some encounters, but there is no clear evidence for a continent-wide campaign of extermination. Competition may have mattered, but competition can mean many things: pressure on hunting grounds, differences in social networks, faster innovation, larger populations, wider exchange, or better survival during hard years. Disease may have played a role, especially when separated populations met after long isolation. Interbreeding certainly happened, and this complicates the word extinction itself. Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct population, but part of them survived inside later humans. That genetic survival is both intimate and haunting. A small percentage of Neanderthal ancestry remains in many people outside sub-Saharan Africa today. These inherited fragments affect aspects of immunity, skin, metabolism, and other traits. Though the story is complex and still under study, the human body becomes a kind of archive, carrying faint signatures of meetings that no myth remembers, somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago. Individuals from different human groups had children whose descendants eventually became part of the wider Homo sapiens population. The fossil record cannot tell us what those meetings felt like. The genome only shows that they happened. The Denisovans are even more ghostly. For a long time, no one knew they existed. Then a tiny finger bone from Denisova cave in Siberia yielded DNA, unlike that of both modern humans and Neanderthals. Later, teeth and fragments added to the picture, but the physical portrait remains incomplete. They are a population known more from genetic signals than from skeletons, which would have sounded impossible not long ago. Their ancestry appears in living populations across parts of Asia and Oceania, with especially notable traces in indigenous peoples of New Guinea and nearby regions. A Denisovan-related genetic variant is also associated with high-altitude adaptation in Tibetans, suggesting that vanished humans may have helped living humans survive in extreme environments. But who were the Denisovans in daily life? What did they look like across their range? How many Denisovan populations existed? Did they live in forests, mountains, river valleys, islands, or all of these? the evidence remains incomplete. A jawbone from the Tibetan plateau has been linked to Denisovan relatives, widening their known world dramatically, but the full map is still uncertain. They may not have been one uniform people at all, but a set of related populations spread across huge distances. In that case, the word Denisovan may be less like the name of a single group and more like a label placed over several missing histories. Then there are the island humans, who make the story even less tidy. On Flores, in Indonesia, small-bodied Homo floresiensis lived until surprisingly recent times in evolutionary terms. Their remains, including the famous skeleton from Liangbua Cave, show a creature with a small body and small brain, yet associated with stone tools and survival in a challenging island environment. Scholars still debate their ancestry. Were they descendants of an early Homo erectus population that shrank through island evolution? Did they come from an even older lineage? No single explanation fully accounts for every feature, and the debate continues because the bones are few. The island record is difficult, and evolution on islands can produce unexpected forms. On Luzon in the Philippines, another small and puzzling human relative, Homo luzonensis, is known from fragmentary remains. Its anatomy contains a mixture of traits that unsettles neat evolutionary ladders. Again, the evidence is limited, but the implication is enormous. Southeast Asia and island worlds may have hosted multiple human experiments, some isolated for long periods, some adapting in ways that break familiar expectations. Warm climates destroy evidence quickly, which means the few discoveries that survive may represent only a small portion of what once existed. The most surprising finds may not be exceptions. They may be survivors of a much broader lost diversity. Even Homo erectus, older and longer lived, complicates the picture. This species or group of related populations spread far beyond Africa long before Homo sapiens, surviving across vast spans of time. In parts of Asia, late dates have been debated, raising questions about whether modern humans may have overlapped with descendants of these older populations. The details remain uncertain, but the broader point stands. Human evolution was not a clean relay race where one form passed the torch to the next. It was a branching, overlapping, uneven process, with different human groups occupying the planet at the same time. So why are they gone? The answer may not be one answer. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, Homo luzonensis, and other possible late surviving human relatives lived in different places, under different pressures. Some may have been absorbed into expanding Homo sapiens populations. Some may have dwindled because their numbers were small and their ranges limited. Some may have been vulnerable to climate swings, volcanic eruptions, ecological change, or competition for prey. Some may have met modern humans only briefly. Others may have never met us at all. Extinction is often imagined as a dramatic final moment, but for small populations it can be quieter, fewer births, more deaths, broken exchange networks, one valley lost, one island disaster, one generation with no recovery. A lesser-known detail makes this especially sobering. Small groups can vanish without leaving obvious signs of catastrophe. They do not need a massacre layer or a sudden burned horizon. If a population is already fragile, a few bad seasons can be enough. Isolation can become dangerous when mates are scarce and knowledge networks shrink. A hunting technique, a plant calendar, a crossing route, a medicinal practice, or a memory of where water remains during drought can disappear with a handful of elders. In the archaeological record, this may look like a gap. In life, it would have been the end of a world. The survival of Homo sapiens may have depended less on individual brilliance than on networks. Larger connected populations can preserve innovations more easily. If one group loses a tool-making method, another can reintroduce it. If one region suffers, people can move, exchange, marry, and rebuild. Social connection becomes a technology as important as stone. Some researchers argue that modern humans may have had broader exchange networks or more flexible symbolic systems, helping them withstand environmental shocks. Scholars still debate how far this explains the disappearance of other human groups, but it points to a powerful possibility the last human standing may not have been the strongest in body, but the most connected across distance. Yet this should not become a triumph story. The disappearance of other humans is not merely a step toward us, it is a narrowing. Once, many kinds of human eyes looked at firelight. Many kinds of hands shaped stone. Many kinds of children learned landscapes that are now gone. Their worlds had their own histories, their own fears, their own forms of belonging. Science can recover their teeth, tools, bones, and genes, but not the names they used for rain, the gestures they made over the dead, or the stories they told about animals moving in the dark. The vanished human cousins leave behind one of the deepest gaps of all, not just what happened to them, but what it meant to share the planet with minds both like and unlike our own. They force us to see humanity not as a single inevitable line, but as a fragile remnant of a once wider family. The modern human face, reflected everywhere today, is also the face of survival after loss. Inside it, faintly, are traces of those others. Around it is silence. Inside the human body there is another kind of ruin, one that cannot be seen in stone or ash. It sits in patterns of DNA, in the narrowness and branching of ancestry, in the strange fact that living humans are genetically close to one another compared with many other widespread animals. This does not mean humanity began from a single couple, as old myths sometimes imagine, and it does not mean the past can be reduced to one dramatic near ending. But it does suggest that our ancestors passed through periods when populations were small, scattered, stressed, and vulnerable, somewhere in deep time, long before the first cities and long before written memory. Humanity may have come closer to disappearance than comfort allows. The idea of a human bottleneck is both powerful and easy to misunderstand. A bottleneck happens when a population shrinks so much that later generations carry only a limited sample of the earlier genetic diversity. It can be caused by climate, disease, famine, migration, isolation, volcanic disaster, or repeated local collapses rather than one single event. What survives in the record suggests that ancient humans endured severe pressures, but the exact causes, timing, and scale remain debated. The evidence is not a clean scar with a label attached. It is more like a series of shadows in the genome, each hinting at survival through constriction. One famous suspect has long been the Toba supereruption, which occurred around 74,000 years ago in what is now Indonesia. It was one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the last few million years, throwing enormous amounts of material into the atmosphere and leaving a vast caldera behind. For a time, some researchers proposed that Toba caused a volcanic winter severe enough to crash human populations dramatically. The image is unforgettable ash-darkened skies, failing plants, cold seasons, starving animals, and small groups of humans clinging to survival. But the evidence remains incomplete, and many scholars now treat the strongest version of this theory with caution. Archaeological sites in parts of Africa and India suggest continuity across the eruption, rather than universal devastation. Toba may have caused serious regional disruption, But no single explanation fully accounts for the genetic patterns of human diversity. This is where the mystery deepens rather than disappears. If there was no simple toba-driven near extinction, then the bottleneck problem becomes broader and more interesting. Human populations may have been repeatedly squeezed by changing climates across the late Pleistocene. Glacial cycles altered rainfall. Coastlines, forests, deserts, and animal ranges. A region that supported people for centuries could become dry, cold, flooded, or unstable. Groups might fragment into refuges, reconnect when conditions improved, then fragment again. Instead of one apocalypse, there may have been a long rhythm of pressure and release, with human survival depending on movement, memory, and social ties. Africa itself contained many such refugees and barriers. During dry periods, deserts expanded and wetlands retreated. During wetter periods, rivers, lakes, and grasslands opened corridors. Populations could become isolated in southern coasts, eastern highlands, river systems, or other favorable zones. Over time, isolation would shape genetic differences, while later contact would mix them again. Scholars still debate the exact structure of these ancient African populations. But the emerging picture is not of one small tribe waiting to populate the world. It is of a continent-wide human story, with groups sometimes separated by harsh environments and sometimes connected by windows of opportunity. A lesser-known detail is that ancient population size is not the same as the number of people alive at any one moment. Genetic studies often estimate something called effective population size, which reflects how much genetic diversity is passed on, not a direct census. A population can have many living people, but still pass through a genetic narrowing if only some groups contribute descendants to the future. Other groups may vanish, be absorbed, or leave no living line. This matters because the ancestors of living humanity are not the same as all humans who existed. The genetic record is written by survivors, and survivors can give a distorted impression of how crowded or empty the world once was. This makes deep human history both more fragile and more tragic. There may have been thriving groups whose bloodlines ended completely. They may have left tools in a cave, hearths under sediment, or shell beads near an ancient shore, but no descendants. In genetic terms, they become ghosts. In human terms, they were complete worlds. Their songs, taboos, roots, jokes, griefs, and techniques vanished not because they were unimportant, but because history does not preserve importance. It preserves continuation. Bottlenecks also raise a difficult question about culture. If a population shrinks too far, knowledge can disappear. A technique known by only a few people may fail to pass on. A seasonal route may be forgotten. A ritual object may lose its meaning. A tool form may vanish for reasons that have nothing to do with intelligence. Experiments with small group learning suggest that complex skills are easier to maintain in larger, connected populations. This may help explain why certain technologies appear, fade, and later reappear in the archaeological record. The evidence remains incomplete, but it reminds us that culture is not automatic. It needs people, practice, and continuity. The human bottleneck, then, may have been not only biological but cultural. Imagine a cold, dry phase pressing into a landscape. Herds move away. Edible plants become unreliable. Children die more often. Elders carry knowledge that becomes harder to apply because the world they remember is changing. Neighboring groups are too far away to exchange partners, tools, stories, or help. In such a world, survival depends on flexibility, but flexibility itself depends on memory. if too many links break. A group can lose more than numbers, it can lose options. Yet humans did survive, and this survival is not a small fact. It suggests extraordinary adaptability. People endured by shifting diets, moving across landscapes, using fire, sharing food, caring for injured members, making tools from local materials, and maintaining social bonds across hardship. The fossil record includes individuals who survived injuries or conditions that likely required care from others. This detail is easily overlooked, but it matters. Cooperation was not a sentimental extra in human evolution. It was a survival system, a species that can carry the weak, feed the sick. And remember, distant water has advantages that do not fossilize easily. There is also evidence that hardship may have driven innovation, though not in a simple heroic way. Environmental stress can destroy populations, but it can also force new strategies when enough social structure remains. Coastal foraging, long-distance raw material movement, symbolic marking, refined hunting techniques, and flexible settlement patterns may all become more important in unstable worlds. But scholars still debate whether innovation surged because of cognitive change, demographic growth, climate pressure, or better preservation of sites. The safest answer may be that these forces interacted. Human beings did not become modern through one switch being thrown. They became modern through countless adjustments under pressure. The bottleneck in our blood also changes how the later human story feels. The rise of art, farming, cities, and writing can seem inevitable when viewed backward, but they were built on a foundation that might easily have failed. Before humanity filled continents, it survived as scattered populations exposed to climate swings and local extinction. Before empires counted armies, small groups counted days of food, remembered waterholes, and watched the skies for signs. The distance between a lost band and a future civilization is immense, but the connection is direct. Every city stands downstream from some group that did not vanish. Still, the genetic record cannot give us the full human experience of near loss. It cannot tell us who looked across a drying lake and decided to leave. It cannot tell us which child survived a famine and became an ancestor to millions. It cannot tell us how many groups disappeared just beyond the edge of recovery. It can only show that ancestry narrows, expands, mixes, and narrows again. The rest must be inferred from climate records, archaeology, and the stubborn fact of human persistence. The bottleneck is therefore not a single locked room with one missing key. It is a corridor of uncertainties. Toba may be one shadow in it, but not the whole darkness. Climate instability, fragmented habitats, small group size, failed migrations, disease, and chance all likely shape the survival of our species. What remains most unsettling is that the difference between existence and disappearance may once have been measured in very small numbers, a few more children living, a few elders remembered, a few groups reconnecting before isolation became permanent. Humanity carries that narrow passage forward without noticing it. Every modern crowd, every language, every city street, every archive, every song descends from survivors of pressures that left no written record. The body remembers in fragments. The earth remembers in ash, pollen, and bone. Between them lies the missing story of how close the human line may have come to thinning beyond repair, and how, somehow, it widened again. Before writing, before cities, before carved laws, before a ruler could command a scribe to trap a victory in clay, there is speech. It leaves the mouth warm and alive, then disappears. It does not fossilize. It does not settle into sediment. It does not survive as a clean mark in stone unless someone later gives it a visible body through symbols. For this reason, one of the most important turning points in human history is also one of the hardest to see. At some point, human communication becomes more than warning calls, gestures, emotional sounds, or practical signals. It becomes language in the full human sense, a system able to hold memory, instruction, imagination, kinship, danger, grief, humour, and worlds that are not physically present. Yet the moment it happens is hidden almost completely from direct view. The mystery is not whether humans speak now, or whether language is central to human life. The mystery is when language became fully modern, how gradually it formed, and whether other human relatives shared parts of it. Fossils can reveal the shape of a skull, the position of a vocal tract only indirectly, the structure of a hyoid bone when one is preserved, and sometimes the neurological implications of brain size and form. Ancient DNA can reveal variants of genes involved in speech and language, though genes are not language by themselves. Stone tools can suggest planning and teaching. Burials, ornaments, pigments, and art can suggest symbolic thought. But none of these gives us the sound of a sentence spoken by a person standing beside a fire 100,000 years ago. What survives in the record suggests that the roots of language are deep. Humans are social primates, and communication did not appear from nothing. Earlier hominins almost certainly used gestures, calls, facial expressions, and learned signals. Complex hunting, tool-making, child-rearing, and group movement all benefit from communication. But fully modern language is something stranger. It allows a person to speak of yesterday, tomorrow, the dead, the invisible, the possible, the forbidden, the sacred, and the false. It lets knowledge accumulate outside one mind. A route to water can become a story. A dangerous animal can become a warning passed to children who have never seen it. A rule can outlive the person who first enforced it. This is where science meets a difficult gap. Language is behavior, and behavior is usually preserved only through its effects. A finely made tool may imply teaching, because the technique is too precise to learn easily without demonstration and correction. But teaching can happen through gesture as well as speech. A burial may imply ritual meaning, but ritual can exist with limited language or with rich language that leaves no trace. Cave art may imply symbolic communication, but the image alone does not reveal the grammar surrounding it. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single object can announce the birth of speech. Neanderthals make the question more complicated. They possessed anatomical features that suggest at least some capacity for speech, and they carried a version of the FOXP2 gene often discussed in relation to language, though this gene is sometimes oversimplified in popular accounts. FOXP2 is not a magical language switch. It is involved in complex motor control and speech-related abilities, and language depends on many genes and brain systems. Still, the presence of similar biological foundations in Neanderthals raises a serious possibility they may have had spoken communication more sophisticated than once assumed. Scholars still debate how close it was to modern human language. But the older picture of mute or nearly mute Neanderthals has become difficult to defend. Denisovans, with their shadowy genetic presence, widen the uncertainty. If they were close relatives of Neanderthals and modern humans, they may also have had significant communicative capacities, but with so few physical remains, their language abilities remain almost completely unknown. This is one of those places where the gap is not dramatic because evidence conflicts, but because evidence barely exists. A whole population may have spoken across mountains and valleys, named animals. warned children, exchanged mates, remembered the dead, and argued over food, and science has almost no direct way to hear them. The birth of language may not have been a single birth at all. It may have been a long accumulation, better vocal control, richer gesture, shared attention, memory, imitation, symbolic marking, social teaching, and eventually grammar capable of endless recombination. Perhaps early humans first used systems that were powerful but not fully modern. Perhaps different groups developed different levels of complexity. Perhaps language as we know it emerged gradually, then crossed a threshold when population networks grew dense enough for cultural complexity to accelerate. The evidence allows several possibilities, and the strongest explanations often combine biology with social life rather than choosing one. A lesser-known clue comes from the difficulty of making certain stone tools. Some prehistoric technologies require a sequence of actions that must be learned carefully, choosing the right stone, preparing a core, striking at the correct angle, managing force, anticipating the shape of flakes before they detach. Researchers who study toolmaking sometimes find that verbal instruction can improve learning, though skill demonstration also matters greatly. This does not prove that ancient toolmakers had modern language, but it suggests that technological traditions and communication evolved together. A tool is not just an object, it is a lesson fossilized in stone. Language also changes time. Without language, memory can exist, but language allows memory to become portable and shared. A group can preserve information about a place not currently visible. It can coordinate seasonal movement. It can classify plants, animals, relations, obligations, and dangers. It can create identity: who belongs, who marries whom, who owes what, who must not enter a certain place, who remembers the old path. Such structures leave indirect marks in archaeology through patterns of exchange, settlement, burial, and art, but the spoken systems behind them are gone. The loss is enormous. Most human languages that ever existed have disappeared without a trace. Even in recent history, languages can vanish after only a few generations of pressure, and with them go ecological knowledge, oral literature, humour, place names, and ways of dividing the living world. In deep prehistory, this loss is almost total. We do not know the first words for fire, mother, hunger, river, bone, moon, stranger, or death. We do not know whether early humans sang to children with repeated sounds, whether they named stars, whether they used metaphor, whether they insulted, blessed, counted, or prayed. It is likely that they did many of these things in some form, but likelihood is not recovery. This matters because language may be the invisible engine behind later visible changes, the spread of symbolic objects, long-distance exchange, complex rituals, and eventually farming and cities all depend on communication systems that can organize people beyond immediate reaction. A seed-planting tradition must be taught. A boundary must be described. A myth can make strangers cooperate. A command can move workers. A law can outlast anger. The first city is built not only with mud brick, but with words strong enough to make people imagine a shared order. Yet language also carries danger. It allows deception, rumour, exclusion, command, and inherited fear. It can bind a group together or turn one group against another. It can preserve knowledge, but also preserve mistakes. It can turn a memory of drought into a ritual rule that saves lives, or a story of outsiders into violence. The rise of language is not merely a triumph of expression. It is the beginning of a new kind of human power, one that shapes reality by naming it. Science may never find the first language, because there was probably no first language in the simple sense. There was no morning when silence ended and grammar began. Instead, across thousands of generations, sounds became more controlled, meanings more layered, teaching more precise, stories more durable, and identity more abstract. By the time language is undeniable in its effects, it is already ancient. When people paint animals deep inside caves, bury the dead with care, carry shells far from the sea, or carve marks into bone, they are likely already living in worlds thick with speech, but the speech itself has flown. So the lost language dawn remains one of the biggest gaps in human history because it sits at the root of almost everything that follows. It is the missing bridge between biology and culture, between a clever primate and a creature able to carry invisible worlds inside the mouth. The stones remain, the bones remain, the pigments remain. But the words that gave them meaning are gone, and with them the first human histories ever told. Then, almost without warning in the long rhythm of prehistory, the wolves begin to speak. Deep inside caves where sunlight never reaches, human hands press pigment against stone, leaving negative silhouettes that feel immediate even tens of thousands of years later. Animals emerge in motion, bison twisting, horses running, lions watching, rendered with an attention that suggests not just observation but meaning. Lines are carved, dots are placed, shapes repeat. In some places, bones are arranged, beads are strung, bodies are painted, and objects are carried far from their origin for reasons that cannot be explained by survival alone. Something changes, or perhaps something that had been building quietly finally leaves a visible trace. The archaeological record brightens with signs of symbolic life. This shift has often been called a kind of creative explosion, but that phrase may say more about modern surprise than ancient reality. The evidence remains incomplete, and what looks sudden may partly reflect preservation. Cave walls protect paintings in ways open-air art cannot. Organic materials decay. Earlier symbolic expressions may have existed in forms that did not survive body painting, wood carving, fibre work, sand drawings, performance, sound. Still, there is no denying that around 40 to 50,000 years ago, especially in parts of Europe but also elsewhere, the record fills with unmistakable signs of symbolic behaviour at a scale and intensity that is difficult to ignore. The question is not simply what these images are, but why they appear so vividly. Scholars still debate whether this reflects a cognitive change, a demographic threshold, a cultural tipping point, or some combination. One idea suggests that as human populations grew and connected across larger networks, innovations could accumulate rather than disappear. Another points to environmental stress, where unstable climates pushed people to strengthen social bonds through shared symbols, rituals, and identity. A third looks to the maturation of language, allowing more complex ideas to be transmitted and preserved. No single explanation fully accounts for this moment, and it may not be a single moment at all, but a pattern that becomes visible when conditions align. The art itself resists simple interpretation. It is tempting to read cave paintings as decoration, storytelling, or early attempts at representation, but their placement often suggests something more deliberate. Many are located deep within cave systems, in spaces that require effort, planning, and light to reach. Some chambers seem to have been revisited across generations. Certain animals are depicted repeatedly, while others are ignored, even when all were present in the environment. Human figures are rare or stylized. The meaning is not obvious, and scholars still debate whether these images relate to hunting magic, spiritual beliefs, memory practices, initiation rites, or something entirely different. A lesser-known detail adds to the mystery. In some caves, acoustics appear to matter. Areas with strong echoes or unusual sound properties sometimes coincide with painted chambers, suggesting that sound and image may have been linked. This does not prove a specific ritual, but it hints at a sensory world richer than the static images alone. Firelight flickering across uneven surfaces could animate figures. Shadows could shift. Voices could carry. What survives in the record is a frozen trace of something that was once dynamic, immersive, and probably communal. Beyond caves, the evidence spreads. Personal ornaments, beads made from shells, teeth, bone, and stone appear in increasing numbers. These are not tools for survival in the narrow sense. They signal identity, status, belonging, or memory. Pigments such as red ochre are used not only for practical purposes, but also for marking bodies and objects. In some burials, individuals are placed with care, sometimes with goods that suggest symbolic intention. The dead are no longer simply absent. They are handled in ways that imply meaning beyond immediate disposal. Music, too, may be part of this emerging world. Flutes made from bone and ivory have been found in Upper Paleolithic contexts, indicating that humans were producing structured sound. The melodies are lost, but the instruments remain. Rhythm, voice, and movement likely accompanied daily life, ritual, and memory. Sound leaves almost no trace in the archaeological record, but its presence is strongly suggested by these artifacts. A world of image without sound is unlikely. A world of symbol without rhythm is difficult to imagine. This flowering of art and symbolism changes how humans relate to time. Images can outlast the moment of their creation. Ornaments can carry memory across distance. Rituals can connect generations. Identity can be marked and recognized beyond immediate kin. A group can become more than a collection of individuals. It can become a shared story. This does not mean earlier humans lacked identity or meaning, but it suggests a widening of how meaning is expressed and preserved. Yet even here, the gaps remain. Why do certain regions show dense concentrations of art while others appear quieter? Is this a true difference in behavior, or a result of preservation? Did symbolic practices spread through contact, or arise independently in multiple places? How much variation existed between groups, and how much has been lost? The evidence gives patterns, but not complete explanations. There is also a tension between continuity and change. Some elements of symbolic behavior appear earlier than the so-called explosion. Use of pigments, possible ornaments, and hints of structured behavior can be traced back well before the Upper Paleolithic. This suggests that the capacity for symbolism did not suddenly appear, but was present and developing. What changes may be the scale, frequency, and visibility of expression. A threshold is crossed, but the path to that threshold is long and uneven. The human mind in this period is both familiar and distant. The ability to create art that still feels alive suggests emotional depth, observation, and intention that resonate across time. At the same time, the meanings behind those creations are largely inaccessible. A painted animal is not just an animal. It is part of a system of thought that no longer exists in full. We can describe the image, date the pigment, analyze the technique, and compare patterns. But the inner logic remains partly hidden. This is one of the central paradoxes of human history. The more expressive the evidence becomes, the more it reminds us of what cannot be recovered. A cave painting is a message without a key. It proves that humans were thinking symbolically, but not exactly how. It reveals skill, but not belief. It shows presence, but not story. The sudden fire of art, then, is not only a burst of creativity, it is a boundary. On one side lies a long stretch of human existence where symbolic life is mostly invisible to us. On the other side, symbols become abundant enough to leave a lasting mark. Between them is a transition that science can outline but not fully explain. Scholars still debate the causes, the timing, and the implications, and each new discovery shifts the picture slightly. What is certain is that once this threshold is crossed, human history takes on a new dimension. The world is no longer only lived, it is represented. It is not only experienced, it is remembered in forms that can outlast individuals. The cave walls, the beads, the pigments, and the instruments are not just artifacts. They are the first surviving fragments of human imagination made visible. And they mark a turning point where the inner life of our species begins to leave a trace that time cannot entirely erase. The old roads are not all on land anymore. Some of the most important human pathways lie under the sea, buried beneath silt, coral, drowned river valleys, and the slow weight of rising water. During the coldest phases of the Ice Age, so much water is locked in glaciers that sea levels fall dramatically, exposing wide coastal plains where there are now waves. Islands become peninsulas, straits narrow, river mouths stretch farther outward, forests, wetlands, grasslands, and hunting grounds spread across shelves that modern maps colour blue. For thousands of years, people live on these vanished edges of the world, and then the ice melts, the water returns, and entire human landscapes disappear. This is one of the most difficult gaps in human history because it is not just a missing object or a lost language, it is missing geography. The stage itself has been removed. Archaeologists can search caves, river terraces, deserts, and ancient lake beds. But if early people followed coastlines, many of their camps, burial places, shell middens, tool-making sites, and crossing points now lie offshore. What survives on land may be only the inland shadow of a much richer coastal story. The evidence remains incomplete not because humans left no trace, but because the trace may be under meters of water. During the last ice age, the world looks unfamiliar. The North Sea is not only sea, large parts of it form a low landscape often called Doggerland, connecting Britain to continental Europe. Herds move across plains that later drown. Rivers carve channels where fishing boats now pass overhead. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf links much of the mainland to islands now separated by water, creating vast lowlands crossed by rivers and forests. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania are joined into the larger landmass known as Sahel, though reaching it still requires water crossings. Around the Bering region, exposed land connects Asia and North America, forming a cold, complex world of steppe, wetlands, and migration routes. These were not empty bridges, they were inhabited landscapes. Doggerland offers a haunting example because it vanished relatively recently in geological terms. For Mesolithic people living there, the change was not a single instant but a long transformation. Marshes expanded, coastlines retreated, storms reshaped low ground, and the sea slowly claimed familiar territory. A catastrophic submarine landslide off Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, sent tsunamis across parts of the North Atlantic around 8,200 years ago, likely striking already vulnerable coastal zones. Scholars still debate the precise human consequences, but the image is stark people living on a shrinking world, watching the horizon move closer over generations, and then perhaps seeing water arrive with terrifying speed. What survives in the record suggests occupation, adaptation, and loss, but much of the human experience is gone beneath the seabed. Submerged landscapes matter because coastlines are unusually attractive to humans. They offer fish, shellfish, birds, plants, driftwood, marine mammals, fresh water near river mouths, and natural travel corridors. A group following a coast does not need to cross unknown inland terrain all at once. It can move from one familiar resource zone to another, learning tides, seasons, reefs, and estuaries. Some scholars argue that coastal routes may have played a major role in early human dispersals, including movements along the Indian Ocean rim and into the Americas. The evidence remains difficult to recover, but the logic is strong enough that the absence of sites cannot be treated as proof of absence. The coastline itself has moved. The peopling of the Americas shows how powerful this problem is. For decades, the main story emphasized an inland route through an ice-free corridor after the last glacial maximum, but accepted archaeological sites south of the ice sheets are now old enough to make a later-only inland route difficult as the whole explanation. A Pacific coastal route, sometimes imagined as a movement along kelp-rich shorelines, has become increasingly important in scientific discussion. Yet many of the earliest possible camps would have stood on coastal ground now underwater. The mystery is not simply when people arrived, but how much of the arrival route the ocean has erased. A lesser-known detail is that underwater archaeology is not just about shipwrecks. It can recover prehistoric land surfaces, ancient forests, stone tools, animal bones, and evidence of human activity from now submerged shelves. In some places, divers and researchers have found preserved tree stumps rooted in drowned soils, reminding us that beneath the sea there were once dry places with shade, insects, birds, and human footprints. But working underwater is slow, expensive, technically difficult, and often limited by visibility, currents, sediment movement, and preservation. The scale of the submerged world is enormous compared with the number of places that can be carefully studied. The drowning of Ice Age worlds also changes how we think about memory. People living through rising seas would not have described it as global sea level rise. They would have known local change, a beach gone, a spring turned brackish, a burial ground threatened, a shellfish bed shifted, a path flooded, a storm reaching farther inland than before. Over generations, stories may have preserved memories of lost lands. Some indigenous traditions around the world contain accounts of coastal change that researchers have compared with post-Ice Age sea level rise, though such connections must be handled carefully and respectfully. Oral memory can endure, but it changes form, and science must not flatten living traditions into simple geological footnotes. Still, the possibility is striking. A flood remembered in story may not refer to one universal catastrophe, but to many local drownings, each devastating to those who lived there. The end of the Ice Age was not just a warming curve on a chart, it was a restructuring of human worlds. Camps moved, hunting grounds vanished, islands formed, populations were separated or forced together. New coasts created new opportunities, but only after old ones disappeared. For people without written records, the sea was both provider and thief. These vanished routes also complicate the evidence for early seafaring. Humans reached Australia long before agriculture, metal, or writing, which means some form of water crossing was achieved by people with Paleolithic technologies. They did not need ships in the modern sense, but they needed knowledge, planning, and the ability to move across water gaps with enough people to establish lasting populations. Later movements through island Southeast Asia and the Pacific would become even more complex, but the deep roots of human engagement with water are older than once imagined. The record is fragmentary, yet the crossings happened. What disappears under the sea is not only movement, but experiment. Coastal groups may have developed specialized tools, seasonal calendars, fishing techniques, boat-building traditions, and social networks that left little surviving trace. Fiber, wood, nets, traps, and simple watercraft decay quickly unless preserved under unusual conditions. A stone tool found inland may look more impressive than a vanished net that once fed a community for generations. Preservation favors the hard and heavy. But human ingenuity often lives in the flexible and perishable. The ghost roots of Ice Age worlds remind us that history is shaped by geography, and geography itself is unstable. The map beneath our feet is not permanent. The shorelines that seem fixed to modernize are recent arrangements. Many ancient people lived in places that no longer exist as land, and their disappearance from the record may be an accident of water, rather than a sign that they were few or unimportant. As the sea rises over the old coasts, it does something. History, often does it, hides the ordinary places where life actually happened. Not the ceremonial cave, not the rare burial, not the stone monument, but the camp near fresh water, the fish trap in a tidal channel, the path between dunes, the place where children learn the taste of shellfish and elders watch storms gather. These were human worlds as real as any city, and many of them are now unreachable except through scattered clues. Seabed cores and the occasional artifact pulled from below. The missing archive has become a drowned archive. The same silence that covered the footprint in ash now moves with tides. Beneath the waves lie roads that may explain how humans spread, survived, met, separated, and remembered. Science is beginning to follow those roads underwater, but slowly. The sea keeps its evidence well, and sometimes it keeps it forever. When the ice retreats and the seas settle into new shapes, another human mystery begins in the soil. Across several parts of the world, people who have lived for immense stretches of time by hunting, gathering, fishing, foraging, burning landscapes, following seasons, and managing wild resources begin to change their relationship with plants and animals. They do not simply discover farming as if it were an obvious improvement waiting to be found. They begin a long, uneven, often uncomfortable experiment in staying closer to one place, tending certain species, storing food, defending harvests, and tying survival to fields that can fail. It is one of the most consequential decisions in human history, and also one of the strangest. From the distance of modern life, agriculture can look inevitable. Crops feed cities, cities build states, states write records, records tell history. But for the people at the beginning, farming was not clearly easier. Early farmers often worked harder than many foragers, ate narrower diets, suffered new diseases from crowding and animals, faced crop failure, and became more vulnerable to drought, pests, and conflict over stored food. Their bones sometimes show stress, repetitive labor, and nutritional problems. The mystery is not why farming eventually transformed the world. The mystery is why anyone began moving in that direction when the cost was so high. The answer is not one answer. Agriculture appears independently, or at least through different local pathways. In several regions, the Fertile Crescent with wheat, barley, sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, China with rice in the south and millet in the north, New Guinea with root crops and complex plant management, Mesoamerica with maize, beans, squash, and other crops, the Andes with potatoes, quinoa, llamas, and alpacas, parts of Africa with sorghum, pearl millet, yams, and cattle traditions, Eastern North America with local seed crops before maize becomes dominant. Each region has its own ecology, timing, and social conditions. Scholars still debate the details, but the global pattern suggests that after the last ice age, humans in many places were experimenting with intensified food production. Climate matters deeply. The end of the Pleistocene brings warming, shifting rainfall, changing animal ranges, and new plant communities. In some regions, the relative stability of the Holocene may have made cultivation more reliable than it had been during earlier climate swings. In others, local stress may have pushed people to manage resources more closely. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to colder and drier conditions around the end of the Ice Age, has often been discussed in relation to early cultivation in Southwest Asia, where communities that had become more settled may have faced pressure on wild food sources. But no single climate event fully explains farming everywhere. Climate opens and closes possibilities. It does not plant seeds by itself. In the Fertile Crescent, the transition is especially well studied, yet still not simple. Before full agriculture, Natufian communities in the Levant live in more settled ways than many earlier foragers, harvesting wild cereals, using grinding stones, building substantial structures, and burying the dead in ways that suggest strong attachment to place. They are not farmers in the full later sense, but they are no longer moving through the landscape in the same old patterns. Then, over generations, people begin cultivating plants more deliberately. Wild grasses become domesticated cereals, but the biological changes do not happen overnight. Seeds grow larger, stalks change so that grains remain attached for harvesting. Human selection slowly reshapes plants, even if the earliest cultivators do not fully understand the genetic consequences. A lesser-known detail is that domestication often produces dependence in both directions. Humans reshape plants and animals, but plants and animals reshape humans. Wheat becomes better suited to harvesting, but people must prepare soil, sow, weed, guard, harvest, thresh, grind, store, and protect it. Goats and sheep provide meat, milk, hides, and woolly futures, but they require herding, water, breeding control, and defense. A crop field is not just food. It is a promise made months before hunger arrives. It requires faith in a future harvest and enough social order to keep that promise alive. This changes time itself. Foragers often know seasonal cycles with extraordinary precision, but farming binds labor to delayed reward in a new way. A planted field asks people to remain, return, or organize around a fixed place. Storage creates surplus, but surplus creates temptation. Grain in a pit can feed a family through winter. It can also attract raiders, rodents, rulers, and tax collectors. The seed becomes the beginning of wealth, and wealth becomes the beginning of inequality. Not immediately, not everywhere, and not in one simple line, but the possibility grows. The archaeological record shows that early villages are not merely clusters of houses. They are experiments in living with new tensions. People must manage land, labor, inheritance, water, marriage, storage, and conflict. The dead may be buried beneath floors, as if ancestry itself is used to anchor rights to place. Houses are rebuilt in the same locations. Ritual spaces appear. Communities grow larger than the intimate scale of small mobile bands. Disease spreads more easily when humans live close together, and when animals live close to humans. Waste accumulates. Social friction becomes harder to escape because moving away now means abandoning fields, houses, and stored food. Yet agriculture also creates new power. More food can support more children. Sedentary life can shorten birth intervals because families no longer need to carry infants over long distances as often. Population grows. Larger populations can clear more land, defend territory, build structures, and absorb losses. Farming spreads not because it is always better for each individual body, but because farming communities can become demographically powerful. They expand, mix with foragers, adopt local practices, and sometimes replace older lifeways. In some places, foragers adopt crops selectively while keeping hunting and gathering central. In others, farming arrives with migrating people. The evidence remains incomplete and regionally varied. The rise of farming also alters the human relationship with animals. Domestication is not merely capture. It requires generations of selection for behavior, breeding, and usefulness. Dogs came earlier, likely from wolf populations drawn into human worlds through hunting, scavenging, guarding, and companionship. Later domesticated animals change diet, mobility, disease, clothing, trade, warfare, and ritual. Cattle become food, wealth, labor, and symbol. Sheep and goats turn marginal lands into human calories. Pigs thrive near settlements. Llamas transform Andean transport. But animal domestication also brings pathogens closer. The long future of epidemic disease begins partly in the barnyard, the pen, and the crowded village. In Mesoamerica, maize reveals another kind of mystery, the patience of transformation. Maize descends from teosinte, a wild grass that does not look like an obvious ancestor of the large ears familiar today. Its domestication required long selection, knowledge, and cultural commitment. Early maize was not immediately a world-conquering staple. It became one through generations of cultivation, breeding, cooking practices, and integration with beans, squash, chilies, and other foods. This was not primitive accident. It was deep botanical engineering carried out without modern genetics, guided by observation, taste, storage, ritual, and survival. In the Andes, farming rises in vertical worlds where altitude changes everything. People cultivate different crops at different elevations, herd camelids, use terraces, manage water, and build exchange systems linking coast, highland, and jungle edge. Here agriculture is not simply a field on a plain. It is a strategy for turning extreme geography into diversity. In New Guinea, complex plant management and wetland agriculture challenge older models that focus too heavily on grain-based civilizations. Human food production does not have one form. History often privileges the crops that later states can tax and store, but gardens, tubers, tree crops, and wetlands may sustain worlds that leave less obvious records. The agricultural turning point is therefore not a single revolution, despite the famous phrase Neolithic revolution. It is more like a long negotiation with uncertainty. People intensify the use of wild resources, they encourage useful plants, they return to productive places, they store more, they protect patches, they select seeds, they manage animals. Eventually, landscapes become domesticated, and so do human schedules. The hand that scatters seed also ties itself to the field. What makes this one of history's great gaps is the missing inner motive. Archaeology can show when crops change, when settlements grow, when grinding stones multiply, when animal bones reveal managed herds. It can show diet, disease, trade, and settlement. but it cannot fully recover the argument within a community when old ways began to give way. Did elders resist staying too long in one place? Did younger families see stored grain as security? Did ritual leaders claim that certain fields belonged to ancestors or spirits? Did hunger force cultivation? Or did abundance allow experimentation? Scholars still debate these questions because the evidence records behavior more clearly than intention. And yet, once farming takes hold, everything downstream begins to change. Population grows, villages thicken, land becomes inheritance, storage becomes power, labor becomes organized, ritual becomes tied to place, conflict over fields and water becomes more likely. The gap between those who control surplus and those who produce it begins to widen. The first cities are not inevitable, but the conditions that make them possible gather slowly in granaries, corrals, terraces, irrigation channels, and houses rebuilt over the bones of the dead. Humanity does not simply choose agriculture and march into civilization. It enters a bargain with the earth. The bargain brings food, numbers, settlement, and memory anchored in place. It also brings toil, disease, inequality, vulnerability, and new forms of dependence. From this point onward, history becomes heavier. The soil begins to hold not only seeds, but obligations. And in that weight, the next great mystery takes shape: how small communities learn to become cities, and how strangers began trusting systems too large for any one person to fully understand. A city begins before anyone knows what a city is. It begins as a thickening of paths, a place where people return more often than they leave, where houses press closer together, where storage pits multiply, where smoke rises from many roofs, where strangers become familiar by repetition rather than kinship. At first, it may not look like the beginning of a new world. It may look like a large village, a ritual gathering place, a protected settlement, a market, a shrine, a bend in a river where soil is good and memory is strong. But slowly, something changes. Human life becomes dense enough that no one can know everyone, and yet the community still holds. This is one of the great unsolved transitions in history. Humans evolved in small social worlds, where reputation, kinship, face-to-face memory, and shared survival could regulate behavior. Cities demand something stranger. They require cooperation among people who are not close relatives, who may not recognize one another, who may perform different kinds of labor, worship in shared spaces, follow rules they did not personally create, and trust stores, walls, leaders, rituals, measures, schedules, and promises. The first cities appear without written manuals, without earlier examples in some regions, and without any guarantee that crowding people together will produce anything except disease, conflict, and collapse. In Mesopotamia, the process unfolds across river plains where water, mud, reeds, grain, and labor can be reorganized into settlement on a new scale. Places like Uruk grow into enormous urban centers by the standards of their time, with monumental architecture, craft specialization, long-distance exchange, administrative systems, and eventually writing. But Uruk does not appear from nowhere. It rises from older village traditions, irrigation practices, temple economies, and expanding networks of exchange. What survives in the record suggests planning and hierarchy, but scholars still debate exactly how centralized the earliest authority was, how much temples controlled production, and how ordinary households negotiated power. The city is not simply a bigger village, it changes the human senses. Sound becomes layered animals, grind in stones, footsteps, work, ritual, voices, carts, tools, and disputes. Smell thickens with cooking, smoke, waste, animals, damp mud brick, beer, grain, and bodies. The horizon narrows into walls and streets, but the world also expands through trade. A person in an early city might touch stone, shell, timber, metal, or pigment that came from lands they would never see. Urban life creates distance and intimacy at the same time. Strangers live closer than kin once did, while goods and ideas travel farther than most feet. The mystery is how such places stayed coherent. Food had to arrive, water had to be managed, waste had to be tolerated or removed, buildings had to be repaired, fields outside the city had to feed mouths inside it, conflicts had to be settled before they tore the settlement apart, labor had to be coordinated for walls, canals, temples, storage, and defense. Some of this could be achieved through kinship and custom at first, but as scale increased, new systems became necessary. Seals, tokens, tallies, standardized containers, measured rations, and eventually written signs all point toward a growing need to track obligations beyond memory. This administrative pressure is one of the surprising roots of writing. The first written marks in Mesopotamia are not epic poems or personal confessions. They are deeply practical records, goods, labor, numbers, commodities, transactions. The human imagination eventually fills writing with myth, lore, literature, astronomy, letters, and lamentation. But the earlier city writes because memory is no longer enough. Grain must be counted, sheep must be assigned, workers must be fed, offerings must be recorded. The gap between human memory and urban complexity becomes clay. But cities do not all follow the same path. In the Indus world, settlements such as Harappa and Mohenjo-daro show remarkable planning, drainage systems, standardized weights, baked brick architecture, and wide trade connections. Yet clear evidence for kings, giant palaces, or violent royal display is less obvious than in Mesopotamia or Egypt. The undeciphered Indus script deepens the mystery, leaving scholars unable to read the society's own words. What survives in the record suggests organization on a large scale, but not exactly the kind of power behind it. Was authority corporate, mercantile, ritual, household-based, or simply expressed in forms that archaeology has not yet identified? The evidence remains incomplete. Egypt offers another version, where cities, temples, kingship, river cycles, and burial landscapes intertwine with the Nile. Here the state becomes visible early through monumental building and royal ideology. Yet even Egypt's impressive record leaves gaps. The daily lives of workers, farmers, boatmen, brewers, and families remain far harder to reconstruct than the ambitions of kings. Monumentality can deceive. It makes power look eternal, even when the human labor beneath it is fragile. Negotiated and often invisible. In China, early urban and state formation develops through regional cultures, walled settlements, ritual production, bronze traditions, and eventually dynastic histories that look backward through layers of memory and politics. In Mesoamerica and the Andes, urbanism emerges along very different ecological and social routes, with ceremonial centers, plazas, pyramids, irrigation, terraces, and exchange systems shaped by local landscapes. The first cities are not a single invention copied from one source. They are multiple answers to the problem of density, food, belief, labor, and power. A lesser-known detail is that some early large sites may have been powerful gathering places before they were fully urban in the later sense. Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Anatolia, predates agriculture as traditionally imagined in the region and contains monumental ritual structures built by hunter-gatherer or transitional communities. It does not mean civilization began there in a simplistic way, and popular claims often stretch the evidence too far, but it does show that large-scale cooperation and symbolic construction could precede farming villages becoming cities. The relationship between ritual, settlement, and agriculture is more tangled than older models allowed. This matters because cities are not built by food alone. They are built by belief. People must accept reasons to work beyond immediate hunger to raise walls, dig canals, build platforms, maintain shrines, obey calendars, give surplus, follow leaders, or participate in rituals. These reasons may be economic, religious, defensive, ancestral, or all at once. A city is a physical settlement, but also a shared fiction strong enough to organize labor, the god, the king, the ancestor, the market. The law, the measure, the seal, the boundary. These are invisible architectures. Without them, mud brick is only mud brick. Urban life also creates new inequalities. Craft specialists depend on food produced by others. Administrators control records. Ritual authorities claim access to forces beyond ordinary life. Warriors and guards may gain status. Land and storage become concentrated. Yet inequality does not appear everywhere in the same way or at the same speed. Some early settlements show hierarchy sharply, others obscure it. Scholars still debate how much coercion versus cooperation shaped the first urban systems. Did people gather willingly around temples and trade, only later finding themselves trapped by debt, land, and authority? Did elites impose order from the beginning? Did defense against outside threats strengthen internal control? No single explanation fully accounts for the variety. The first cities also magnify risk. A bad harvest in a small mobile group may be answered by movement. A bad harvest in a city can become famine, unrest, migration, or political crisis. Crowding encourages disease. Stored grain attracts pests. Irrigation can bring salinization if poorly managed. Trade networks bring wealth, but also dependency. The same density that creates innovation creates vulnerability. Cities are engines of memory and machines of risk. And still, people keep building them. They do so because cities offer possibilities no small settlement can match: security, exchange, ritual grandeur, specialized skill, marriage networks, political power, stored food, and the feeling of living at the center of something larger than oneself. The first urban people may not have thought of themselves as making history. They were solving immediate problems, honoring gods, feeding families, following leaders, repairing walls, carrying baskets, brewing beer, shaping bricks, and counting grain. Yet their ordinary acts created a new human condition. The gap science still cannot fully close is the inner transformation required to live among strangers. Archaeology can reveal walls, streets, drains, temples, workshops, graves, storage rooms, and tablets. It can show diet, disease, trade, craft, and status. But it cannot completely recover the psychological shift the moment when people began trusting systems larger than personal memory. The city required humans to imagine belonging at a scale that biology had not prepared them for. And once that imagination worked, the world changed. From the outside, the first cities look like ruins waiting to happen. Mud brick erodes, canals clog, kings die, trade shifts, rivers move. But while they stand, they create a new kind of human time. They make archives, calendars, laws, taxes, monuments, and crowds. They preserve more history than earlier worlds, yet they also create new silences, because the people who write are rarely the people who carry the mud. The city solves one gap by making records, and opens another by deciding whose lives are worth recording. Once writing appears, it seems as if the silence should end. Marks press into clay, ink settles on pottery, signs are carved into stone, seals carry names or offices, and suddenly human thought has a second body. A harvest can be counted after the grain is gone. A ruler can command beyond the reach of his voice. A myth can travel farther than the storyteller. A debt can survive the death of the person who remembers it. Writing looks like the answer to the missing archive, but almost immediately, it creates another mystery. Not every written voice can be heard again. Across the ancient world, scripts survive without surrendering their meanings. Some are carved clearly, some are repeated many times. Some appear on seals, tablets, pottery, metal, stone, bone, and walls. They are not invisible. They are not destroyed. They wait in plain sight, carrying human intention across thousands of years, yet no one can confidently read them. This is one of the strangest gaps in history, because the evidence is there. The door remains standing. The problem is that the key is missing. The Indus script is perhaps the most famous of these unread voices. It appears across the vast urban world of the Indus Valley civilization, on seals, tablets, pottery, tools, and other objects. The signs are often beautifully made animals, symbols, short sequences, compact inscriptions. They belong to a civilization that built planned cities, managed drainage, used standardized weights, traded over long distances, and occupied a huge region. Yet because the script remains undeciphered, the society's own political language, religious concepts, personal names, myths, and administrative details are largely hidden. What survives in the record suggests sophistication, but without readable texts, its inner world stays frustratingly distant. The difficulty is not that no one has tried. Many proposals have been made, linking the script to Dravidian languages, Indo-Aryan languages, lost language families, logosyllabic systems, non-linguistic symbols, or administrative marks. Some claims are careful, others are speculative. Scholars still debate whether the inscriptions are long enough and structured enough to prove full writing in the same sense as Mesopotamian cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs. Many inscriptions are very short, which makes decipherment harder. There is no widely accepted bilingual inscription like the Rosetta Stone, no long royal text repeating known names, no obvious alphabetic pattern waiting to be unlocked. The evidence remains incomplete, and the silence of the Indus world continues. This silence changes how the civilization is imagined. In Mesopotamia, texts reveal quarrels, taxes, temple accounts, royal boasts, school exercises, myths, contracts, and complaints. In Egypt, inscriptions turn kingship into a voice that still speaks. In the Indus world, the bricks and drains speak more loudly than rulers. Archaeologists see order, trade, craft, and standardization, but not the words people used for power. Perhaps authority there looked different. Perhaps kingship was less ostentatious. Perhaps power was distributed through councils, merchants, ritual specialists, or household networks. Or perhaps the signs would reveal elites as ambitious as any others, if only they could be read. No single explanation fully accounts for the combination of urban scale and textual silence. Other undeciphered systems deepen the pattern. Linear A, used by the Minoan civilization of Bronze Age Crete, survives on tablets, seals, and ritual objects. its later relative. Linear B was deciphered and shown to represent an early form of Greek, but Linear A records a different, still unknown language. This means the script can be partly understood in terms of signs and structure, yet the language behind it remains obscure. The result is especially tantalizing. Minoan Crete is visible through palaces, frescoes, trade, religious imagery, and later Greek memory, but its own administrative and ritual words remain mostly inaccessible. The Phaistos disc, also from Crete, is even more famous in popular imagination, though it must be treated carefully. Its stamped symbols spiral across a clay disc, unique in form and still undeciphered, because it is a single object without a large comparable corpus. Firm interpretation is nearly impossible. It has inspired countless theories, many unsupported. Its mystery is real, but its usefulness is limited. A lone text can be fascinating and nearly mute at the same time, without repetition. Context and comparison, signs become a mirror for modern imagination. In the Aegean, Anatolia, the Iranian plateau, Central Asia, and beyond, undeciphered or poorly understood scripts mark the edges of recovered history. Proto-Elamite, one of the earliest writing systems from ancient Iran, remains only partly understood. The Rongorongo glyphs of Rapa Nui are another haunting case, though their dating, function, and relation to true writing remain debated. These symbols survive on wooden tablets, but the cultural devastation of Rapa Nui after European contact, slave raids, disease, and colonial disruption helped sever living knowledge that might have explained them. Here the loss is not only ancient, it is historical, violent, and recent enough to remind us that undeciphered writing can result from human destruction as much as deep time. A lesser-known truth about decipherment is that scripts are not solved by brilliance alone. They require luck. Egyptian hieroglyphs became readable because the Rosetta Stone preserved the same decree in Greek, demotic and hieroglyphic forms, and because scholars could build on known languages, repeated royal names, and comparative method. Cuneiform was unlocked through multilingual inscriptions and painstaking comparison. Linear B yielded because there were enough tablets. Repeated sign patterns, place names, and a language that turned out to be Greek. Decipherment needs a large corpus, known context, repeated names, bilingual texts, or a related living or known language. Without these, even a perfectly preserved script may remain closed. Writing also preserves unevenly. Clay tablets baked by accident in fires can survive for millennia. Papyrus, bark, wood, leather, and palm leaves decay unless conditions are unusually dry or sealed. Many societies may have written extensively on materials that disappeared. Others may have relied on mnemonic devices, textiles, knots, carvings, or painted signs that do not fit modern expectations of writing. The absence of texts from a culture does not always mean absence of record keeping. It may mean the archive was made of things time prefers to eat. The Andean quipu makes this point in a different way. These knotted cord devices were used by the Inca and earlier Andean societies for recording information, especially numerical and administrative data, and perhaps more. They are not writing in the alphabetic sense, but they are a powerful recording system. Some researchers argue that certain quipus may encode narrative or more complex information, though the evidence remains debated. If true, part of Andean history may be preserved in a medium modern readers have only begun to understand. The archive is not silent. It uses a different grammar of fibre, knot, colour, and position. The problem of undeciphered voices is not only technical, it is emotional. A short inscription on a seal might name a person whose city, family, and language are gone. A tablet might record a shipment, an offering, a festival, a marriage, a title, or a prayer. A mark scratched on pottery might be ownership, devotion, inventory, or a child's exercise. Without decipherment, the human scale remains blurred. We can see that someone intended meaning, but not what meaning they intended. The gap becomes almost intimate, a message addressed to a world that no longer exists, intercepted by people who cannot understand it. Even readable scripts leave silences. Writing often begins in administration, power, and ritual, not in ordinary confession. The earliest records may tell us more about sheep than sorrow, more about grain than childhood. They preserve the concerns of institutions before the inner lives of common people. And when rulers discover writing, they use it to magnify themselves. Victory inscriptions rarely describe doubt. Royal lists simplify messy succession. Temple records may ignore those outside the temple economy. Writing is not pure memory. It is selected memory, shaped by authority, material, purpose, and survival. Still, when a script is unreadable, the loss is sharper. It blocks entire categories of knowledge. We may not know the names of cities as their inhabitants spoke them. We may not know which gods mattered most. We may not know whether symbols on seals represent titles, clans, commodities, myths, or sounds. We may not know the language family, and therefore cannot trace connections that might reshape migration and cultural history. One decipherment can transform a civilization overnight, not because the stones change, but because they begin to answer back. The undeciphered voices remind us that history is not divided neatly between prehistory and history. Writing does not automatically create understanding. A civilization can be literate and still remain partly prehistoric to us if its script cannot be read. Conversely, a non-literate society may preserve deep memory through oral tradition, landscape practice, and material culture. The boundary is not writing itself, but recoverable meaning. For now, many ancient signs remain suspended between presence and absence. They are visible enough to prove the people wanted to communicate across distance, but closed enough to keep their worlds hidden. They sit in museums and storerooms, stamped on seals, incised on tablets, painted on sherds, twisted into cords, carved into wood. They are not mute by nature. They are muted by broken continuity, and so the archive grows stranger. Humanity invents writing to defeat forgetting, but forgetting follows it into the script. The first cities make records, but some records outlive the ability to read them. The clay survives, the sign survives, the hand survives in its pressure and curve. What disappears is the living chain of understanding, the teacher showing the student, the scribe correcting the apprentice, the community hearing the marks as language. When that chain breaks, even a written voice can fall silent. The first collapses do not announce themselves as collapses. They arrive as late rains, failed harvests, longer journeys for wood, smaller herds, higher prices, abandoned repairs, nervous officials, empty granaries, fortified gates, rumours on roads, and families leaving before anyone admits that an age is ending. A city can look alive while its foundations are already weakening. Temples still receive offerings, scribes still write, kings still claim order, merchants still count goods. But beneath the surface, the systems that hold complexity together begin to strain. Then, sometimes slowly and sometimes with shocking speed, the structure gives way. Human history is full of collapses, but the word can mislead. A civilization rarely vanishes in one clean, dramatic moment. More often, political systems fragment, cities shrink, trade networks break, elites lose legitimacy, writing declines, populations move, and old centers become ruins while life continues elsewhere in different forms. Collapse is not always the end of people. It is the end of a particular arrangement of power, settlement, economy, belief, and memory. The evidence remains incomplete, because those who live through collapse are often too busy surviving to leave orderly explanations behind. The Bronze Age collapse in the Eastern Mediterranean is one of the most famous examples because so many powerful systems falter around the same broad period. Palaces burn or are abandoned, trade networks weaken, the Hittite Empire disappears, Mycenaean palace culture breaks apart. Cities in the Levant suffer destruction or transformation. Egypt survives but is weakened. Later records speak of movements of peoples, attacks from groups often called Sea Peoples, famine, and disorder. But no single explanation fully accounts for the scale of the disruption. Climate stress, drought, earthquakes, internal rebellion, warfare, migration, piracy, dependence on bronze trade, and fragile palace economies may all have interacted. The Bronze Age world was more connected than it first appears. Tin, copper, grain, luxury goods, timber, horses, textiles, and diplomatic gifts moved across long distances. Palaces depended on administrators, scribes, craft specialists, farmers, sailors, and political relationships that stretched beyond any one kingdom. This interconnection created wealth, but it also created vulnerability. If one link broke, others felt the shock. A drought could weaken harvests. Weak harvests could reduce tribute. Reduced tribute could undermine rulers. Undermined rulers could lose control of labor, armies, and trade. Raiders and migrants might then become both cause and consequence of instability. Collapse feeds on feedback. A lesser-known detail is that some destruction layers may not mean foreign invasion at all. Burned palaces can result from internal conflict, accidental fires, local revolts, earthquakes followed by fire, or later reuse of ruins. Archaeology preserves the fact of burning more easily than the identity of the hand that caused it. A city wall smashed in one place may look like war, but the wider context may suggest abandonment, rebuilding, or shifting settlement patterns. Scholars still debate many individual sites because destruction is easier to see than causation. Climate, however, repeatedly appears in collapse stories because agricultural societies live within narrow ecological agreements. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia has been linked by some researchers to a major aridification event around 4,200 years ago, though the relationship between climate and political collapse remains debated. Old Kingdom Egypt also undergoes decentralization and crisis around a similar broad period, with low Nile floods often discussed as a contributing factor. In the Indus world, shifts in river systems, monsoon patterns, trade, and urban organization may have helped transform large cities into smaller settlements. The Maya lowlands experienced severe droughts during periods of political fragmentation and urban decline. In each case, climate is not a puppet master pulling a single string. It is a pressure that acts on human systems already shaped by inequality, governance, warfare, land use, and belief. The classic Maya collapse shows why the word collapse must be used carefully. Maya civilization did not disappear. Maya people, languages, and traditions continued and still continue. What declined was a particular pattern of powerful lowland city-states, monument building, dynastic competition, and elite display in certain regions. Drought likely worsened the crisis, but warfare, political rivalry, environmental stress from dense populations, and the burden of elite demands all mattered. Kings who claimed sacred authority over cosmic order faced a terrible problem when reigns failed and wars multiplied. If power is built partly on the promise of balance, repeated failure can become political poison. The Indus transformation is quieter and, in some ways, more mysterious. The great urban centres decline, standardised systems weaken, long-distance trade patterns shift, and populations move toward different regions and smaller settlements. But there is less evidence for widespread violent destruction than in some other collapse narratives. Without a deciphered script, the internal political story remains hidden. Did changing rivers undermine agricultural foundations? Did monsoon weakening make large urban centres harder to sustain? Did trade with Mesopotamia decline and reduce elite coordination? Did people choose to disperse into more resilient rural lifeways? What survives in the record suggests transformation rather than sudden annihilation. But the causes remain layered and debated. Collapse also exposes the fragility of specialization. In a complex society, not everyone grows food. Some people make metal tools, keep records, perform rituals, govern, build ships, transport goods, or fight. This division of labor creates efficiency and cultural richness, but it depends on stable exchange. If the farmers cannot supply the city, if trade routes fail, if scribble schools close, if authority stops paying workers, specialized knowledge can vanish quickly. A bronzesmith without tin is no longer part of the same world. A scribe without a palace economy may have no students. A shipbuilder without trade may lose the reason to build large ships. Complexity can unwind faster than it was assembled. There is a human cost hidden behind these patterns. Collapse means hunger, migration, broken obligations, lost status, abandoned homes, and sometimes violence. It also means adaptation. People salvage wood from old buildings, turn temples into shelters, farm different lands, join new groups, adopt new languages, and carry old memories into changed worlds. Archaeology often finds the ruin, but not the conversation at the doorway when a family decides to leave. It finds the storage jar, but not the moment when the stored grain runs out. It finds the city gate, but not the fear of those waiting outside it. The strangest thing about collapse is how often it becomes visible only after people have tried not to collapse. Rulers build bigger monuments to assert control. Fortifications grow stronger. Ritual intensifies. Records become more anxious. Demands on farmers increase. Armies move more often. These efforts may hold a system together for a time, but they can also deepen the strain. A society under pressure may double down on the very structures that make it brittle. The evidence remains incomplete, but this pattern appears often enough to feel familiar. Modern observers sometimes look for the single fatal floor drought: invasion, plague, decadence, bad rulers, environmental damage. Ancient collapses resist that simplicity. A drought that one society survives may destroy another because institutions differ. Trade loss may be manageable for a village but catastrophic for a palace economy. War may strengthen a state if victory brings resources, or shatter it if defeat breaks legitimacy. Disease may pass through a sparse population with limited effect, but devastate dense urban networks. Collapse is not a cause. It is the moment many causes meet. And yet collapse is also a creator. After the Bronze Age collapse, new political forms emerge, iron technologies spread, smaller kingdoms rise, Phoenician maritime networks expand, alphabetic writing gains importance. Greek society eventually reorganizes in new ways. The end of one world becomes the soil of another. This does not soften the suffering of those who live through it, but it complicates the meaning of disappearance. History often advances by forgetting the people crushed in transition. The collapse patterns reveal another gap. Science cannot fully explain the threshold. We can identify pressures, but not always why a system holds for one more generation, and then fails. Why does one city adapt while another empties? Why does one ruler retain loyalty while another loses it? Why does a drought become a crisis in one region and a transformation in another? The answer lies in countless details: storage capacity, social trust, leadership, trade alternatives, local ecology, inequality, memory of earlier disasters, and sheer luck. Many of those details leave only faint traces. By the time a collapsed city becomes a ruin, the decisive moments are already gone. The archive may record a famine, an invasion, or a king's boast, but it rarely captures the slow erosion of confidence. Complexity depends on belief as much as infrastructure belief that grain will arrive, that rulers can protect, that debts matter, that gods remain favourable, that tomorrow will resemble yesterday enough to plan. When that belief fails, walls still stand for a while. Then they become stone. The great collapses of human history are not warnings from a distant, foolish past. They are reminders that civilization is a living arrangement, not a permanent achievement. It must be fed, repaired, trusted, defended, and renewed. When climate, conflict, disease, inequality, and fragile networks converge, even powerful worlds can become archaeological layers. The mystery is not that civilizations fall. The mystery is how long they stand before anyone realizes the ground beneath them has already begun to move. The ruins of kings are often easier to find than the rooms of the people who fed them. A palace leaves foundations. A temple leaves carved stone. A tomb can preserve gold, weapons, vessels, painted walls, and the carefully arranged body of someone considered important enough to protect from time. But the woman grinding grain until her joints ache, the child carrying water, the shepherd sleeping near animals, the potter's apprentice, the midwife, the enslaved worker, the field labourer, the migrant, the outsider, the old person who knows where medicinal plants grow. These people made history every day, and most of them passed through it almost invisibly. This is one of the widest gaps in human history, not because ordinary people were rare, but because they were everywhere. They built the world that elites claimed. They planted, harvested, hauled, cooked, cleaned, nursed, repaired, traded, buried, remembered, and endured. Yet the record favours those with durable houses, formal burials, written titles, and control over materials that survive. Even when common people appear in documents, they often appear as numbers, workers assigned. Rations distributed, taxes owed, captives taken, land measured, bodies counted. Their own voices are usually absent. Women are especially vulnerable to this historical disappearance. They are central to survival, reproduction, craft, food processing, healing, teaching, and household economies. But many ancient records were produced by male-dominated institutions, courts, temples, armies, and administrations. This does not mean women lacked power everywhere. In some societies, women owned property, managed workshops, served as priestesses, participated in trade, ruled as queens, or held ritual authority. But the evidence is uneven, and scholars still debate how much agency women had in many ancient contexts because law codes, elite tombs, and administrative texts rarely capture the full complexity of lived experience. Archaeology has begun to change this, sometimes in surprising ways. For a long time, assumptions shaped interpretation as much as evidence did. A grave with weapons was often presumed male. A grave with ornaments was often presumed female. Tools found near skeletons were read through modern expectations about labor and gender. But DNA analysis and improved osteological methods have complicated these patterns. Some individuals buried with weapons or signs of high-status activity have turned out to be women. Some craft tools and domestic objects reveal skilled labor previously dismissed as ordinary household work. What survives in the record suggests that ancient gender roles varied far more than simple stereotypes allow. Though the evidence remains incomplete, a lesser-known detail is how much labor hides in bones. Repetitive work leaves traces: worn joints, muscle attachment marks, spinal stress, dental wear from using teeth as tools, injuries healed through care, nutritional deficiencies from unequal diets. A skeleton can reveal that someone knelt often, carried heavy loads, ground grain, endured childbirth stress, survived infection, or lived long after an injury. These signs do not give a name, but they restore weight to lives that written history ignores. The body becomes a document written by labor. Common people also vanish because their homes were built from fragile materials. Mud brick melts back into earth, wood rots, reed walls decay, floor surfaces are swept, reused, repaired, and buried beneath later floors. Everyday objects break and are discarded in ways that may seem meaningless until studied closely. A rubbish pit can reveal diet, trade, craft, illness, fuel use, and household habits more honestly than a royal inscription. The most humble debris may be the most truthful archive a society leaves. Still, even archaeology struggles to recover emotion. It can show infant mortality, but not the grief of parents. It can show a crowded neighborhood, but not whether neighbors trusted or feared one another. It can show differences in diet, but not the resentment at a table where some ate better than others. It can show migration through isotopes in teeth, but not whether a person moved by marriage, trade, exile, slavery, hunger, or hope. The evidence speaks in patterns, not full biographies. Slavery and forced labor create another vast silence. Ancient economies often depended on captives, debt servants, corvée laborers, and people whose freedom was restricted in ways that varied by society. Some appear in texts as property, tribute, labor units, or prisoners. Others disappear into construction projects, mines, fields, households, and armies. Monumental architecture can make forced labor look glorious from a distance. Up close, it is bodies moving stone, mud, water, and grain under systems they may not control. No single explanation fully accounts for every labor system, and not all large projects were built by enslaved workers. But the human cost of ancient power is often under-recorded. Children, too, are nearly everywhere in the past and nearly nowhere in formal history. They carried messages, watched animals, gathered fuel, learned crafts, cared for siblings, played, copied adults, and died in large numbers. Their fingerprints sometimes survive on clay objects. Tiny footprints appear in ancient floors. Toys, miniature tools, and learning mistakes suggest childhood worlds inside great historical processes. A child pressing fingers into wet clay did not know that the mark might outlast dynasties. Such traces are small, but they pull history back toward the scale at which life was actually lived. The missing common people matter because they change the meaning of major events. A collapse is not just the fall of a palace, It is families deciding where to sleep when grain stops arriving. A migration is not just a line on a map. It is feet, hunger, fear, and carried infants. A religious transformation is not just a new temple. It is household ritual changing near the hearth. A war is not only kings and armies, it is fields burned, sons taken, daughters displaced, captives marched, and old people left behind. Without ordinary lives, history becomes architecture without inhabitants. Recovering those lives requires patience with small evidence. Grinding stones reveal food labour. Loom weights reveal textile production. Cooking pots reveal diet and identity. Burial positions reveal care and custom. Stable isotopes reveal weaning, migration, and inequality. Ancient DNA reveals kinship, ancestry, and sometimes unexpected family structures. Residues in pottery reveal milk, beer, oils, or stews. Dental plaque can preserve traces of plants, proteins, and microbes. Science has made the ordinary increasingly visible, but visibility is still partial. The problem is not only ancient. Later historians also chose what mattered. Chronicles praised rulers. Colonial observers misunderstood or dismissed local systems. Early archaeologists removed spectacular objects while ignoring soil layers, seeds, bones, and household debris. Museums displayed treasures more readily than tools. For generations, the past was curated around power, beauty, and conquest. Scholars now work to widen the record, but the older imbalance cannot be fully undone. Many sites were excavated before modern methods could recover everyday evidence. Many human traces were thrown away as unimportant. And yet, the common people are not completely gone. They survive in the polish on a tool handle, in the smoke stain above a hearth, in the repaired crack of a pot too useful to discard, in a child's tooth marked by hunger, in a woman's spine bent by work, in a footprint crossing a floor before it dried. They survive in the fact that cities kept eating, fields kept producing, cloth kept being woven, and houses kept being rebuilt. The powerful may have written the official memory, but ordinary hands made memory possible. The gap remains because most of these lives cannot be restored as stories with beginnings and endings. They can be approached only through fragments. But those fragments are enough to correct the scale of history. The past was not mainly made by the few whose names survived. It was carried by the many whose names did not. The missing women and common people are not a side note to the human story. They are the human story, with only the edges illuminated. Some of the most powerful forces in human history leave almost no visible shape while they're moving through the world. They do not build walls, carve statues, or write decrees. They travel in breath, blood, fleas, lice, water, milk, grain stores, animal pens, burial cloth, and the crowded warmth of human bodies. A pathogen can enter a village without a banner and leave behind only absence, fewer children playing, fewer fires at night, more shallow graves, fields untended, houses sealed, roads avoided, stories darkened by fear. Long before anyone understands microbes, disease is already rewriting the human past. Ancient plague is one of the hardest gaps to study because epidemics often move faster than durable evidence forms. A disease can kill thousands and leave no specific mark on bone. Many infections do not scar skeletons at all, especially if they kill quickly. Written accounts, when they exist, may describe symptoms in vague or frightened language, shaped by religious interpretation, rumour, or limited medical knowledge. Archaeology may find mass graves, but mass death can result from war, famine, massacre, disaster, or disease. The evidence remains incomplete, and for much of history the dead carry their cause silently. Modern science has changed this dramatically. Ancient DNA can sometimes recover traces of pathogens from teeth, bones, and preserved tissues. Dental pulp, sealed inside teeth, can protect microbial DNA long after the rest of the body decays. Through this, researchers have identified ancient strains of plague, tuberculosis, hepatitis B, smallpox-related viruses, and other diseases in remains from different periods. This does not solve every mystery, but it opens a hidden archive inside the dead. The body is not only a record of ancestry and diet, it can also preserve the invisible enemies that move through human populations. One of the most famous is Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague. It is known from the Justinianic plague in the 6th century, the Black Death in the 14th century, and later outbreaks. But ancient DNA has pushed plague's history much deeper, into the Bronze Age. Early forms of Yersinia pestis existed before the fully flea-borne bubonic plague system became dominant, suggesting that the disease changed over time. This matters because it raises the possibility that prehistoric and ancient population shifts may have been influenced by epidemics we're only beginning to recognize. Scholars still debate the scale of these early outbreaks, but the genetic evidence shows that plague was present far earlier than written history could have told us. The Bronze Age steppe migrations, for example, transformed the genetic landscape of much of Europe and parts of Asia. These movements involved pastoralist populations, wagons, animals, and wide networks across open grasslands. Alongside them, ancient plague strains have been detected in some individuals. This does not mean plague caused the migrations, or that it explains the entire transformation. Such claims would go too far, but disease may have been one factor among many, moving with people and animals, weakening some communities, altering demographic balance, and spreading through contact zones. No single explanation fully accounts for the vast changes of the Bronze Age, but pathogens now belong in the conversation. Agriculture made disease more powerful. Sedentary villages placed people close to waste, standing water, stored food, and domesticated animals. Larger populations gave pathogens more hosts. Animals brought new microbial opportunities. Rodents thrived near grain. Mosquitoes benefited from irrigation and water management in some regions. Trade routes carried not only goods, but infections. Cities became engines of culture and administration, but also ideal habitats for disease. The same density that allowed writing, craft specialization, markets, and temples also allowed microbes to circulate with brutal efficiency. A lesser-known detail is that many classic epidemic diseases require large enough populations to persist. A pathogen that infects and then leaves survivors immune may burn out in a small scattered group because it runs out of hosts. In dense urban networks, it can keep moving, jumping between neighborhoods, towns, armies, ports, and trade routes. Civilization did not invent sickness, but it created new ecological conditions for sickness to become historical. The city is not only a human settlement, it is also a microbial landscape. The written record occasionally captures the terror. Ancient sources describe plagues in Athens, Rome, Byzantium, China, the Islamic world, medieval Europe, and elsewhere. But the identity of these diseases is often debated. The so-called Plague of Athens during the Peloponnesian War devastated the city in the 5th century BCE, killing many, including Pericles, and weakening Athenian power at a crucial moment. Scholars have proposed typhus, typhoid fever, smallpox, measles, viral hemorrhagic fever, and other possibilities. The symptoms described are vivid but not definitive. The disease changed history, but its exact identity remains uncertain. The Antonine Plague in the Roman Empire, beginning in the 2nd century CE, may have been smallpox or a similar disease, though certainty remains elusive. It struck during a period of military movement and imperial connectivity, killing large numbers and straining the empire's army, economy, and social fabric. Later, the Justinianic plague swept through the Byzantine world and beyond, with ancient DNA confirming Yersinia pestis in associated remains. Even then, debates continue about the mortality scale and long-term impact. Disease is historically powerful, but measuring its power is difficult because it interacts with war, climate, trade, taxation, and political resilience. The plague shadows are especially dark where writing is absent or scarce. In prehistoric villages, an epidemic might reduce a community so severely that it abandoned a settlement. Another group might move into the empty land generations later, leaving archaeologists to detect discontinuity without knowing the cause. A cemetery with unusual mortality patterns might suggest crisis, but not always identify it. DNA may not preserve. The pathogen may be one science has not yet learned to detect. Many ancient epidemics may have left no recognizable signature at all. Disease also changes contact between populations. When groups long separated meet, they may exchange pathogens as well as goods, genes, and ideas. Some people carry immunity from earlier exposure, others do not. This pattern becomes devastatingly clear in the modern era after transoceanic contact, when smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases contributed to catastrophic mortality among indigenous peoples of the Americas. But the underlying principle is older. Throughout history, frontiers, trade routes, migrations, and conquests likely created microbial shocks. The evidence remains incomplete, but the consequences may have been profound. Pathogens can redirect politics without appearing as political actors. An army weakened by disease may lose a campaign. A ruler dying in an epidemic may trigger succession crisis. A labour shortage after mass death may change wages, land use, or social unrest. A city repeatedly struck by plague may lose population to rural areas. Religious movements may gain strength when existing explanations fail. Scapegoating may turn fear into violence. Quarantine, isolation, burial rules, and public health measures may emerge from desperation long before germ theory. Disease does not merely kill individuals, it pressures institutions and beliefs. There is a quiet cruelty in how epidemics are remembered. The elite deaths are named. The mass deaths become numbers, if they are counted at all. In many places, the poorest suffer most because they live closer together, eat worse food, work through illness, and lack the means to flee. Women caring for the sick, children losing parents, gravediggers overwhelmed, migrants blamed. Strangers feared. These human details are often only faintly visible. What survives in the record suggests social trauma, but the inner experience of epidemic fear is mostly lost. Famine and disease often travel together. Malnutrition weakens immunity. Failed harvests force people to move, beg, crowd into cities, eat unsafe foods, or sell animals and land. War disrupts agriculture and spreads infection through armies and refugees. Climate anomalies can expand the range of disease-carrying insects or rodents. A plague may therefore appear as part of a wider crisis, not an isolated event. Ancient observers may blame bad air, divine anger, comets, foreigners, or moral decline. Modern science can identify microbes, but the lived reality was always tangled. The plague shadows show that history is not only shaped by human intentions, it is shaped by organisms without intentions at all. Bacteria and viruses do not care about empires, rituals, languages, or trade agreements, yet they exploit the connections humans build. The road that carries bronze, silk, grain, pilgrims, soldiers, or letters can also carry fever. The granary that protects against hunger can feed rats. The ship that links ports can bring fleas. The barn that sustains a village can host the next infection. Human success creates microbial opportunity. And still, humans adapt. Survivors develop immunity. Communities change burial practices. Cities regulate waste and water in uneven ways. Medical traditions record patterns, treatments, and observations, even when explanations are wrong. Some societies isolate the sick. Others develop rituals that provide care, meaning, or social order under pressure. These responses do not always prevent death, but they show that people were not passive before disease. They watched, remembered, and tried to live with invisible forces they could not see. The gap science still faces is immense. For every ancient pathogen identified, many remain unknown. For every epidemic recorded, countless others left no text. For every mass grave studied, many bodies decomposed in ordinary soil were cremated or were never buried in ways that preserve evidence. The microbial history of humanity is probably as important as the history of kings, but far less visible. It runs beneath migrations, collapses, farming, cities, and conquest like an underground river. The plague shadows remind us that some of history's missing causes were never hidden, because people failed to notice them. They were hidden because no one had the tools to see them. A cough, a bite, a fever, a rash, a swelling, a contaminated cup, a flea in a blanket. These small things may have altered the fate of cities and empires. Science is beginning to recover their traces, but the largest part of the microbial past remains dark. In that darkness, invisible life moves through human history, changing everything while leaving almost nothing behind. Knowledge can disappear even when the people who once held it do not vanish all at once. It can fade in a workshop when no apprentice comes. It can break in a library fire, in a conquered city, in a language no longer taught to children, in a ritual banned by outsiders, in a famine that kills the elders first, in a change of religion, climate, economy, or power. Human beings often imagine progress as a staircase, each generation standing securely on the step below. The deeper record is less comforting. Knowledge is not a staircase. It is a web, and webs can tear. The problem of forgotten knowledge is not that ancient people possess secret powers beyond modern science. That idea is popular, but it often turns mystery into fantasy. The real mystery is more subtle and more human. Ancient societies developed skills suited to their worlds: how to quarry, move, and fit stone, how to read stars and seasons, how to breed crops without genetics, how to navigate oceans without compasses, how to manage water in deserts, how to preserve food, how to make pigments, medicines, textiles, ceramics, metals, boats, roads, and calendars. Some of this knowledge survived, some was transformed, some was independently reinvented, some disappeared so completely that later people stood among its remains and wondered who could have made such things. The Antikythera mechanism is one of the clearest reminders that ancient technical knowledge could be far more refined than expected. Recovered from a shipwreck near a Greek island, it is a complex geared device used to model astronomical cycles. It does not prove that the ancient world had modern machines, and unsupported claims often exaggerate it. But it does show that Hellenistic craftsmen and thinkers could combine mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, and precision engineering at a remarkable level. What remains is not an isolated miracle from nowhere. It hints at a tradition of instrument making of which very little survives. The mechanism is famous partly because it endured by accident, under the sea, while many comparable devices likely vanished. This is the cruel pattern. Perishable technologies often disappear first. Wood, fibre, leather, papyrus, wax tablets, ropes, sails, baskets, nets, and textiles may have carried much of the ancient world's practical intelligence, but they decay easily. A stone pyramid survives better than the ramps, sledges, ropes, labour organisation, and seasonal planning that made it possible. A bronze sword survives better than the training system behind it. A canal trace survives better than the administrative memory of water allocation. The object remains, but the method becomes uncertain. Ancient engineering often sits inside this gap. The pyramids of Egypt, the moai of Rapa Nui, the stonework of the Andes, Roman concrete, Qanat water systems, Maya reservoirs, Angkor's hydraulic landscape, and Polynesian navigation have all inspired both serious research and wild speculation. The mainstream view does not require lost super-civilizations or outside intervention. It requires something more impressive: generations of observation, labour, experiment, failure, and social organisation. Scholars still debate many specific techniques, especially when direct records are absent. But the broad explanation is human skill operating within cultural systems that valued and transmitted that skill. Roman concrete offers a useful example. Some Roman marine structures endured for centuries in harsh saltwater conditions, and modern researchers have studied their materials to understand why. The answer lies in volcanic ash, lime chemistry, mineral reactions, and craft practice developed through experience. This knowledge did not vanish entirely, but later building traditions changed, materials differed, institutions shifted, and the exact practices were not always continuously preserved. The mystery is not that Romans had magic concrete. It is that technical knowledge depends on supply chains, recipes, workers, standards, and reasons to keep using them. Libraries concentrate the fear of loss into a single image, shelves burning, scrolls blackening, texts becoming smoke. The Library of Alexandria has become the symbol of destroyed knowledge, though popular versions often simplify a long and complicated history of decline, damage, dispersal, and changing institutions. Its loss was not one clean event in which all ancient wisdom burned overnight, but the symbol remains powerful because it captures something true. Written knowledge is vulnerable. A text survives only if it is copied, valued, stored, translated, and protected through political and religious change. Many works of ancient literature, science, history, medicine, and philosophy are known today only by title, quotation, summary, or hostile reference. Whole shelves of thought have become footnotes to books that also barely survived. A lesser-known detail is that survival often depends on boredom as much as brilliance. Administrative copies, monastery routines, school exercises, legal archives, temple inventories, and scribal habits preserved many texts not because they were dramatic, but because institutions repeated them. A manuscript copied for teaching could outlive a masterpiece ignored for a century. A clay tablet listing barley might survive because it was baked in a destructive fire. A philosophical work might vanish because no one found it useful enough to copy. The past is filtered not only by catastrophe, but by maintenance. Language loss is another form of knowledge loss, and it can be devastating. A language is not only a set of words, it encodes classifications of plants, animals, weather, kinship, landscape, obligation, and memory. When a language dies, especially under pressure rather than voluntary change, the world does not merely lose a different way to say the same things, it loses a different map of attention. Place names may preserve routes, hazards, sacred sites, fishing grounds, seasonal camps, or stories of disaster. Once the language is gone, those names can become sounds without instructions. This is especially important for indigenous and oral knowledge systems. For much of modern history, outside observers dismissed them as myth, superstition, or primitive memory, only to later discover that some encoded detailed ecological, astronomical, medicinal, or geological knowledge. This does not mean every tradition should be treated as literal scientific record. It means that knowledge can be stored in story, song, ceremony, kinship, and practice, not only in books. When those systems are broken by colonization, forced schooling, displacement, missionization, disease, or economic pressure, archives vanish without flames. The forgotten knowledge problem also includes knowledge deliberately destroyed. Conquerors burn records to erase legitimacy. States suppress scripts to control identity. Religious movements reject older texts as dangerous. Colonial administrations reorder land knowledge into maps useful for taxation and ownership. Oral specialists die without successors because their roles are criminalized or mocked. In such cases, forgetting is not an accident of time. It is an act of power. The evidence remains incomplete because successful erasure often leaves only the eraser's explanation. Even scientific and technical traditions can be lost through changes in social need. If a trade route collapses, shipbuilding knowledge may decline. If a court stops funding astronomers, observational records may break. If metal sources are cut off, metallurgical skill may narrow. If a city's water system fails and people disperse, maintenance knowledge may scatter. Expertise requires communities. A lone genius cannot preserve a civilization's knowledge if the tools, materials, teachers, apprentices, and institutions disappear around them. There is a haunting humility in ruins that later people cannot explain. Medieval and early modern observers sometimes misattributed ancient monuments to giants, gods, foreigners, or vanished races because they could not imagine the social systems that produced them. This does not prove the builders were beyond understanding. It proves that knowledge of human capability can itself be lost. When continuity breaks, descendants may inherit stones without inheriting the story of how hands raised them. Yet knowledge also survives in unexpected ways. A recipe becomes a ritual. A farming technique becomes custom. A star path becomes a song. A medicinal plant use becomes household habit. A building method persists in village practice long after empires fall. Not all survival is written, and not all loss is total. Sometimes modern science rediscovers what local specialists never forgot. Sometimes archaeology confirms knowledge carried quietly by communities whose authority had been ignored. The gap science still cannot fully close lies in the missing chains of transmission. We can study an artifact and infer how it may have been made, but not always how the maker learned. We can reconstruct a water system, but not the arguments over its repair. We can analyze pigments, alloys, mortar, fibers, and tool marks, but not the apprenticeship jokes, warnings, taboos, and rules of thumb that made the work possible. Knowledge is social before it is technical, and the social part is often the first to vanish. The forgotten knowledge problem warns against two mistakes. The first is arrogance, assuming ancient people could not have achieved impressive things without help from impossible sources. The second is complacency, assuming knowledge, once gained, naturally remains. Human history says otherwise. Skills vanish, archives burn, languages die, systems become unreadable. What one generation finds obvious, another may find mysterious. The past is not only a record of discovery, it is a record of forgetting. By the time modern eyes look back, the ruins seem still, but they are really the remains of motion hands teaching hands, voices naming steps, bodies repeating difficult work until skill becomes invisible. When that motion stops, the object may remain like a shell after the animal inside has gone. Science can study the shell. Sometimes it can reconstruct the creature. But the living chain, the exact way knowledge moved from mind to mind, is often lost. And with it, one of the most fragile forms of human memory. After all the vanished roads, unread scripts, broken cities, lost languages, dead relatives, drowned shores, plague shadows, and forgotten skills, the final gap is the one that remains even when science succeeds. Every generation learns more. A tooth yields DNA, a lake bed gives pollen, a cave floor preserves ash, a satellite finds buried walls beneath desert, a seabed core reveals a vanished plain, a tablet is re-examined with better imaging, a skeleton once misread becomes the center of a new story. The past does not stand still, it changes as the methods for seeing it change. This is what makes the biggest gaps in human history so powerful. They're not empty spaces where nothing can be known. They're frontiers where knowledge keeps advancing and uncertainty keeps surviving. Ancient DNA has revealed human cousins no one knew existed. Underwater archaeology has shown that old coastlines may hold missing migration routes. Climate science has connected droughts, floods, eruptions, and cooling events to moments of stress in human societies. Isotope analysis has turned teeth and bones into maps of diet and movement. Residue studies have found traces of meals, medicines, oils, and fermented drinks inside pots. Microscopes have made ordinary dust meaningful. The smallest evidence now carries enormous weight. And yet the core problem remains. Science can recover traces, not the whole vanished world. It can show that people moved, but not always why they left. It can show that a city burned, but not always who struck the flame. It can show that a child was hungry, but not the voice that comforted them. It can show that a script carried meaning, but not meaning itself if the chain of reading has broken. It can show that other humans lived beside us, but not the names they gave themselves. The evidence remains incomplete, and it always will. That incompleteness is not failure. It is the shape of deep time. Human history was lived forward by people who did not know they were becoming evidence. They were not trying to explain themselves to distant strangers. They were trying to survive a winter, bury a parent, cross a river, repair a wall, teach a child, plant before rain, flee a sickness, remember a route, or keep a story alive for one more generation. What survives in the record is only what time happened to spare. The gaps that remain are therefore not only scientific puzzles, they are reminders of scale. For every famous ruin, there were thousands of forgotten homes. For every king's inscription, there were countless unrecorded voices. For every artifact in a museum, there were gestures, songs, smells, arguments, jokes, and fears that left no durable form. The past is not small because little survives. It is vast because so much has disappeared. Still, the search matters. Each discovery narrows the silence. Each careful excavation, each respectful reading of oral tradition, each new method, each corrected assumption gives the lost human world a little more shape. The goal is not to fill every gap with certainty. It is to listen closely enough to know the difference between evidence and imagination, between mystery and myth, between what can be said and what must remain open. The greatest lesson may be humility. Humanity is not a straight line of inevitable progress. It is a fragile chain of survivors, experiments, accidents, losses, recoveries, and unfinished stories. The modern world rests on countless people who left no names, no portraits, no monuments, only traces, and sometimes not even those. Science can illuminate the darkness, but it cannot abolish it entirely. There will always be a drowned camp no one finds, a language no one hears again, a grave without a marker, a road beneath the sea, a memory that died with its last keeper. In the end, the gaps are part of the human story because forgetting is part of being human. Civilizations rise inside landscapes that change. Bodies carry histories no one remembers. Stones hold pressure from vanished hands. The past reaches toward us in fragments, and we reach back with tools, questions, and caution. Between those two movements lies history itself, not complete, not silent, but broken in ways that still ask to be understood. The long human story fades not into a final answer, but into distance. A shoreline disappears beneath quiet water. A painted animal waits in the dark of a cave. A city wall softens into earth. A bone rests under layers of dust, carrying in its chemistry the last trace of a journey no one recorded. Somewhere, an unread sign still holds a name, a number, a prayer, or a command, and the hand that made it is gone beyond recovery. There is comfort, perhaps, in knowing that disappearance is not the same as nothingness. The people who vanish from memory still shaped the world. Their choices moved seeds, animals, tools, stories, and genes across continents. Their fires changed landscapes. Their paths became routes. Their fears became customs. Their dead became ancestors, even when the names of those ancestors were lost. Every modern life stands on an unseen floor of forgotten lives, and so the mystery remains open, not as a failure of science, but as a measure of time's depth. Some answers will come, others will stay hidden in drowned valleys, broken languages, vanished forests, and fragile traces too small to survive. The past is not a locked room waiting for one perfect key. It is a vast night field where small lights appear one by one, far apart, enough to show direction, never enough to show everything. What remains is the act of looking carefully, a footprint, a tooth, a shard, a wall, a seed, a silence. Each is small, but each says the same thing in its own way. Someone was here. Someone crossed this place before the map changed. Someone carried knowledge that mattered. Someone lived inside a world that felt complete, even though only fragments reached us. And in that thought, the gaps become more than mysteries. They become a kind of memorial, not carved in one language, not owned by one civilization, not finished by one discovery, but spread across the earth itself. The human past is broken, but it is not gone. It waits in ash, stone, bone, water, and memory, still asking us to listen,